Then, the light burned my fingers and fell out of my hand, going out as it dropped, and when I had lit another, the little monster had disappeared. I do not know how long I sat peering down that well. It was not for some time that I could succeed in persuading myself that the thing I had seen was human, but gradually the truth dawned on me. That man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into two distinct animals. That my graceful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generation, but that this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing which had flashed before me was also heir to all the ages. I thought of the flickering pillars and of my theory of an underground ventilation. I began to suspect their true import, and what I wondered was this lemur doing in my scheme of a perfectly balanced organization. How was it related to the hinterland, serenity of the beautiful upper worlders? And what was hidden down there at the foot of that shaft? I sat upon the edge of the whale, telling myself that at any rate, there was nothing to fear, and that there, I must descend for the solution of my difficulties. And with all I was absolutely afraid to go, as I hesitated to of the beautiful upper world people came running in their amorous sport. Across the daylight in the shadow, the male pursued the female, flinging flowers at her as he ran. They seemed distressed to find me, my arm against the overturned pillar, peering down the well. Apparently, it was considered bad form to remark these apertures, for when I pointed to this one and tried to frame a question about it in their tongue, they were still more visibly distressed and turned away, but they were interested by my matches, and I struck some to amuse them. I tried them again about the well, and again I failed. So presently I left them, meaning to go back to Wiener and see what I could get from her, but my mind was already in revolution. My guesses and impressions were slipping and sliding to a new adjustment. I had now a clue to the import of these wells, to the ventilating towers, to the mystery of the ghosts, to say nothing of a hint at the meaning of the bronze gates and the fate of the time machine, and very vaguely they came, a suggestion towards the solution of the economic problem that had puzzled me. Here was the new view plainly. The second species of man was subterranean. There were three circumstances in particular which made me think that it's rare. Emergence above ground was the outcome of a long, continued underground habit. In the first place, there was the bleached look, common in most animals that live largely in the dark, the white fish of the Kentucky caves, for instance. Then those large eyes with that capacity for reflecting light are common features of nocturnal things. Witness the owl and the cat, and last of all that evident confusion in the sunshine, that hasty yet fumbling, awkward flight towards dark shadow, and that peculiar carriage of the head, while in the light all reinforced the theory of an extreme sensitiveness of the retina. Beneath my feet then, the earth must be tunneled enormously, and these tunnelings were the habitat of the new race. The presence of ventilating shafts and wells along the hill slopes everywhere, in fact except along the river valley, showed how universal were its ramifications. What so natural then as to assume that it was in this artificial underworld that such work as was necessary to the comfort of the daylight race was done? The notion was so plausible that I had once accepted it, and went on to assume the how of this splitting of the human species. I dare say you will anticipate the shape of my theory, though for myself, I very soon felt that it fell far short of the truth. At first, proceeding from the problems of our own age, it seems clear as daylight to me that the gradual widening of the present, merely temporary and social, difference between the capitalist and the laborer was the key to the whole position. No doubt it will seem grotesque enough to you, and wildly incredible, and yet even now, there are existing circumstances to point that way. there is a tendency to utilize underground space for the less ornamental purposes of civilization. There's the Metropolitan Railway in London. For instance, there are new electric railways, there are subways, there are underground workrooms and restaurants, and they increase and multiply. Evidently, I thought this tendency had increased, till industry had gradually lost its birthright in the sky. I mean that it had gone deeper and deeper into larger and ever larger underground factories, spending a still increasing amount of its time there, until in the end, even now does not. An East End worker live in such artificial conditions as practically to be cut off from the natural surface of the earth. Again, the exclusive tendency of richer people, no doubt, to the increasing refinement of their education, and the widening gulf between them and the rude violence of the poorer, is already leading to the closing in their interest of considerable portions of the surface of the land, about London for instance. Perhaps half the prettier country is shut in against intrusion, and this same widening gulf, which is due to the length and expense of the higher educational process and the increased facilities for and temptations towards refined habits on the part of the rich, will make that exchange between class and class, that promotion by intermarriage which at present retards the splitting of our species along lines of social stratification, less and less frequent. So in the end, above ground you must have the haves pursuing pleasure and comfort and beauty, and below ground the have-nots, the workers, getting continually adapted to the conditions of their labor. Once they were there, they would no doubt have to pay rent, and not a little of it, for the ventilation of their caverns, and if they refused they would starve or be suffocated, for areas, such of them as were so constituted as to be miserable and rebellious, would die, and in the end, the balance being permanent, the survivors would become as well adapted to the conditions of underground life and as happy in their way as the upper world people were to theirs. As it seemed to me, the refined beauty and the etiolated pallor followed. Naturally enough, the great triumph of humanity I had dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. It had been no such triumph of moral, education, and general cooperation as I had imagined. Instead, I saw a real aristocracy, armed with the perfected science, and working to a logical conclusion, the industrial system of today. Its triumph had not been simply a triumph over nature, but a triumph over nature and the fellow man. This, I must warn you, was my theory at the time. I had no convenient cicerone in the pattern of the utopian books. My explanation may be absolutely wrong. I still think it is the most plausible one, but even on this opposition, the balanced civilization that was at last attained must have long since passed its zenith and was now far fallen into decay. The too perfect security of the upper worlders had led them to a slow movement of degeneration, to a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence, that I could see clearly enough already. What had happened to the underground I did not yet suspect, but from what I had seen of the Morlocks, that by was the name by which these creatures were called, I could imagine that the modification of the human type was even far more profound than among the alloy, the beautiful race that I already knew. Then came troublesome doubts. Why had the Morlocks taken my time machine? For I felt sure it was they who had taken it. Why too, if the alloy were masters, could they not restore the machine to me? And why were they so terribly afraid of the dark? I proceeded, as I have said, to question Wiener about this underworld. But here again, I was disappointed. At first she would not understand my questions, and presently she refused to answer them. She shivered as though the topic was unendurable, and when I pressed her perhaps a little harshly, she burst into tears. They were the only tears except my own I ever saw in that golden age. When I saw them, I ceased abruptly to trouble about the Morlocks. and was only concerned in banishing these signs of the human inheritance from Wiener's eyes. And very soon she was smiling and clapping her hands, while I solemnly burned a match. Chapter 6. It may seem odd to you, but it was 2 days before I could follow up the newfound clue. In what was manifestly the proper way, I felt a peculiar shrinking from those pallid botas. They were just the half-bleached color of the worms, and things one sees, preserved in spirit in a zoological museum, and they were filthily cold to the touch. Probably my shrinking was largely due to the sympathetic influence of the Deloy, whose disgust of the Morlocks I now began to appreciate. The next night I did not sleep well. Probably my health was a little disordered. I was oppressed with perplexity and doubt. Once or twice I had a feeling of intense fear, for which I could perceive no definite reason. I remember creeping noiselessly into the great hall, where the little people were sleeping in the moonlight. That night Wiener was among them, and feeling reassured by their presence. It occurred to me even then that in the course of a few days, the moon must pass through its last quarter, and the nights grow dark, when the appearances of these unpleasant creatures, from below these whitened lemurs, this new vermin that had replaced the old, might be more abundant. And on both these days, I had the restless feeling of one who shirks an inevitable duty. I felt assured that the time machine was only to be recovered by boldly penetrating these underground mysteries. Yet I could not face the mystery. If only I had had a companion, it would have been different, but I was so horribly alone, and even to clamber down into the darkness of the well appalled me. I don't know if you will understand my feeling, but I never felt quite safe at my back. It was this restlessness, this insecurity, perhaps, that drove me further and further afield in my exploring expeditions, going to the southwestward, towards the rising country that is now called Coombe Wood. I observed, far off in the direction of 19th century Banstead, a vast green structure, different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was larger than the largest of the palaces or ruins I knew, and the facade had an oriental look, the face of it having the luster, as well as the pale green tint, a kind of bluish green, of a certain type of Chinese porcelain. This difference in aspect suggested a difference in use, and I was minded to push on and explore, but the day was growing late, and I had come upon the site of the place after a long and tiring circuit, so I resolved to hold over the adventure for the following day, and I returned to the welcome and the caresses of little Wiener. But next morning I perceived clearly enough that my curiosity regarding the palace of green porcelain was a piece of self-deception to enable me to shirk by another day an experience I dreaded. I resolved I would make the descent without further waste of time, and started out in the early morning towards a well near the ruins of granite and aluminium. Little Wiener ran with me. She danced beside me to the well, but when she saw me lean over the mouth and look downward, she seemed strangely disconcerted. "Goodbye, little Wiener," I said, kissing her and then putting her down. I began to feel over the parapet for the climbing hooks. Rather hastily, I may as well confess, for I feared my courage might leak away. At first she watched me in amazement. Then she gave a most piteous cry, and running to me, she began to pull at me with her little hands. I think her opposition nerved me rather. To proceed, I shook her off, perhaps a little roughly, and in another moment I was in the throat of the well. I saw her agonized face over the parapet and smiled to reassure her. Then I had to look down at the unstable hooks to which I clung. I had to clamber down a shaft of perhaps 100 yards. The descent was effected by means of metallic bars projecting from the sides of the well, and these being adapted to the needs of a creature much smaller and lighter than myself. I was speedily cramped and fatigued by the descent. And not simply fatigued, one of the bars bent suddenly under my weight and almost swung me off into the blackness beneath. For a moment, I hung by one hand. And after that experience, I did not dare to rest again. Though my arms and back were presently acutely painful, I went on clambering down the sheer descent. With as quick emotion as possible, dancing upward, I saw the aperture. A small blue disk in which a star was visible, while little Wiener's head showed as a round. Black projection, the thudding sound of a machine below, grew louder and more oppressive. Everything, save that little disk above, was profoundly dark. And when I looked up again, Wiener had disappeared. I was in an agony of discomfort. I had some thought of trying to go up the shaft again and leave the underworld alone. But even while I turned this over in my mind, I continued to descend, at last with intense relief. I saw dimly coming up a foot to the right of me, a slender loophole in the wall, swinging myself in. I found it was the aperture of a narrow, horizontal tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. It was not too soon my arms ached, my back was cramped, and I was trembling with the prolonged terror of a fall. Besides this, the unbroken darkness had a distressing effect upon my eyes. The air was full of the throb and hum of machinery, pumping air down the shaft. I do not know how long I lay. I was roused by a soft hand touching my face, starting up in the darkness. I snatched my matches, and hastily striking one, I saw 3 stooping white creatures, similar to the one I had seen above ground in the ruin, hastily retreating before the light, living as they did. In what appeared to me impenetrable darkness, their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, just as are the pupils of the abysmal fishes, and they reflected the light in the same way. I have no doubt they could see me in that rayless obscurity, and they did not seem to have any fear of me, apart from the light. But so soon as I struck a match in order to see them, they fled incontinently, vanishing into dark gutters and tunnels, from which their eyes glared at me. In the strangest fashion, I tried to call to them, but the language they had was apparently different from that of the overworld people, so that I was needs left to my own unaided efforts, and the thought of flight before exploration was even then in my mind. But I said to myself, "You are in for it now." And feeling my way along the tunnel, I found the noise of machinery grow louder. Presently the walls fell away from me, and I came to a large open space, and striking another match, saw that I had entered a vast arched cabin, which stretched into utter darkness, beyond the range of my light. The view I had of it was as much as one could see. In the burning of a match, necessarily my memory is vague. Great shapes like big machines rose out of the dimness and cast grotesque, black shadows in which dim, spectral Morlocks sheltered from the glare. The place by the by was very stuffy and oppressive, and the faint halidus of freshly shed blood was in the air. Somewhere down the central vista was a little table of white metal, laid with what seemed a meal. The Morlocks, at any rate, were carnivorous even at the time. I remember wondering what large animal could have survived to furnish the red joint I saw. It was all very indistinct. The heavy smell, the big unmeaning shapes, the obscene figures lurking in the shadows, and only waiting for the darkness to come at me again. Then the match burned down and stung my fingers, and fell a wriggling red spot in the blackness. I have thought since how particularly ill-equipped I was for such an experience. When I had started with the time machine, I had started with the absurd assumption that the men of the future would certainly be infinitely ahead of ourselves. In all their appliances, I had come without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke. At times I missed tobacco frightfully, even without enough matches. If only I had thought of a Kodak, I could have flashed that glimpse of the underworld in a second, and examined it at leisure. But as it was, I stood there with only the weapons and the powers that nature had endowed me with: hands, feet, and teeth, these and for safety matches that still remained to me. I was afraid to push my way in among all this machinery in the dark, and it was only with my last glimpse of light I discovered that my store of matches had run low. It had never occurred to me until that moment that there was any need to economize them, and I had wasted almost half the box in astonishing the upper worlders, to whom fire was a novelty, now as I say. I had for left, and while I stood in the dark, a hand touched mine, lank fingers came feeling over my face, and I was sensible of a peculiar, unpleasant odor. I fancied I heard the breathing of a crowd of those dreadful little beings about me. I felt the box of matches in my hand being gently disengaged, and other hands behind me plucking at my clothing. The sense of these unseen creatures examining me was indescribably unpleasant. The sudden realization of my ignorance, of their ways of thinking and doing, came home to me very vividly. In the darkness I shouted at them as loudly as I could. They started away, and then I could feel them approaching me again. They clutched at me more, boldly whispering odd sounds to each other. I shivered violently and shouted again, rather discordantly. This time they were not so seriously alarmed, and they made a queer, laughing noise as they came back at me. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I determined to strike another match and escape. Under the protection of its glare, I did so, and digging out the flicker, with a scrap of paper from my pocket, I made good my retreat to the narrow tunnel. But I had scarce entered this when my light was blown out, and in the blackness, I could hear the Morlocks rustling like wind among the leaves, and pattering like the rain as they hurried after me. In a moment I was clutched by several hands, and there was no mistaking that they were trying to hold me back. I struck another light and waved it. In their dazzled faces, you can scarce imagine how nauseating, the inhuman they looked, those pale, chinless faces and great lidless, pinkish gray eyes, as they stared in their blindness and bewilderment. But I did not stay to look. I promise you I retreated again, and when my second match had ended, I struck my third. It had almost burned through. When I reached the opening into the shaft, I lay down on the edge, for the throb of the great pump below made me giddy. Then I felt sideways for the projecting hooks, and as I did so my feet were grasped from behind, and I was violently tugged backward. I lit my last match, and it incontinently went out. But I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and kicking violently, I disengaged myself from the clutches of the Morlocks, and was speedily clambering up the shaft while they stayed peering and blinking up at me. All but one little wretch who followed me for some way, and well nigh secured my boot as a trophy. That climb seemed interminable to me. With the last 20 or 30 feet of it, a deadly nausea came upon me. I had the greatest difficulty in keeping my hold. The last few yards was a frightful struggle. Against this faintness several times my head swam, and I felt all the sensations of falling. At last, however, I got over the Wellmouth somehow, and staggered out of the ruin. Into the blinding sunlight, I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and clean. Then I remember Wiener kissing my hands and ears, and the voices of others among the Eloi. Then for a time I was insensible. Chapter 7. Now indeed, I seemed in a worse case than before hitherto, except during my night's anguish. At the loss of the time machine, I had felt a sustaining hope of ultimate escape, but that hope was staggered by these new discoveries. To the two I had merely thought myself impeded by the childish simplicity of the little people, and by some unknown forces which I had only to understand to overcome. But there was an altogether new element in the sickening quality of the Morlocks. As something inhuman and malign, instinctively I loathed them. before I had felt as a man might feel, who had fallen into a pit. My concern was with the pit and how to get out of it. Now I felt like a beast in a trap, whose enemy would come upon him soon. The enemy I dreaded may surprise you. It was the darkness of the new moon. Wiener had put this into my head by some, at first, incomprehensible remarks about the dark nights. It was not now such a very difficult problem to guess what the coming dark nights might mean. The moon was on the wane. Each night there was a longer interval of darkness, and I now understood to some slight degree at least the reason of the fear of the little upper world people. For the dark, I wondered vaguely what foul villainy it might be that the Morlocks did. Under the new moon, I felt pretty sure, now that my second hypothesis was all wrong. The upper world people might once have been the favored aristocracy, and the Morlocks their mechanical servants. But that had long since passed away. The two species that had resulted from the evolution of man were sliding down towards, or had already arrived at, an altogether new relationship. The Eloi, like the Carolingian kings, had decayed to a mere beautiful futility. They still possessed the earth on sufferance, since the Morlock, subterranean for innumerable generations, had come at last to find the daily surface intolerable, and the Morlocks made their garments iron-furred and maintained them in their habitual needs, perhaps through the survival of an old habit of service. They did it as a standing horse paws with his foot, or as a man enjoys killing animals in sport, because ancient and departed necessities had impressed it on the organism. But clearly the old order was already in part reversed. The nemesis of the delicate ones was creeping on apace. Ages ago, thousands of generations ago, man had thrust his brother man out of the ease and the sunshine, and now that brother was coming back changed already. The alloy had begun to learn one old lesson anew. They were becoming reacquainted with fear, and suddenly that came into my head. The memory of the meat I had seen in the underworld. It seemed odd how it floated into my mind, not stirred up as it were by the current of my meditations, but coming in almost like a question from outside. I tried to recall the form of it. I had a vague sense of something familiar, but I could not tell what it was at the time, still however helpless. The little people, in the presence of their mysterious fear. I was differently constituted. I came out of this age of ours, this ripe prime of the human race, when fear does not paralyze, and mystery has lost its terrors. I at least would defend myself without further delay. I determined to make myself arms and a fastness, where I might sleep with that refuge as a base. I could face this strange world with some of that confidence I had lost. In realizing to what creatures, night by night, I lay exposed, I felt I could never sleep again. Until my bed was secure from them, I shuddered with horror. To think how they must already have examined me. I wandered during the afternoon along the valley of the Thames, but found nothing that commended itself to my mind as inaccessible. All the buildings and trees seemed easily practical to such dexterous climbers, as the Morlocks, to judge by their wells, must be. Then, the tall pinnacles of the palace of green porcelain and the polished gleam of its walls came back to my memory, and in the evening, taking Wiener like a child upon my shoulder, I went up the hills towards the southwest. The distance I had reckoned was 7 or 8 miles, but it must have been Narrated. I had first seen the place on a moist afternoon, when distances are deceptively diminished. In addition, the heel of one of my shoes was loose, and a nail was working through the sole. They were comfortable old shoes I wore about indoors, so that I was lame, and it was already long past sunset when I came in sight of the palace, silhouetted black against the pale yellow of the sky. Wiener had been hugely delighted when I began to carry her, but after a while she desired me to let her down. and ran along by the side of me, occasionally darting off on either hand to pick flowers to stick in my pockets. My pockets had always puzzled Wiener, but at the last, she had concluded that they were an eccentric kind of vase for floral decoration. At least she utilized them for that purpose. And that reminds me, in changing my jacket, I found the time traveler paused, put his hand into his pocket, and silently placed two withered flowers, not unlike very large white mallows, upon the little table. Then he resumed his narrative. As the hush of evening crept over the world, and we proceeded over the hillcrest towards Wimbledon, Wiener grew tired and wanted to return to the House of Grey Stone, but I pointed out the distant pinnacles of the palace of green porcelain to her and contrived to make her understand that we were seeking a refuge there from her fear. You know that great pause that comes upon things. Before the dusk, even the breeze stops in the trees. To me, there is always an air of expectation about that evening's stillness. The sky was clear, remote, and empty, save for a few horizontal bars far down in the sunset. Well, that night, the expectation took the color of my fears. In that darkling calm, my senses seemed preternaturally sharpened. I fancied I could even feel the holiness of the ground. Beneath my feet could indeed almost see through it, the Morlocks on their anthill, going hither and thither and waiting for the dark. In my excitement, I fancied that they would receive my invasion of their burrows as a declaration of war. And why had they taken my time machine? So we went on in the quiet, and the twilight deepened into night. The clear blue of the distance faded, and one star after another came out. The ground grew dim and the trees black. Wiener's fears and her fatigue grew upon her. I took her in my arms and talked to her, and caressed her. Then, as the darkness grew deeper, she put her arms around my neck and, closing her eyes tightly, pressed her face against my shoulder. So we went down a long slope into a valley, and there in the dimness, I almost walked into a little river. This I waited, and went up the opposite side of the valley, past a number of sleeping houses, and by a statue, a faun or some such figure, minus the head. Here too were acacias. So far I had seen nothing of the Morlocks, but it was yet early in the night, and the darker hours before the old moon rose were still to come. From the brow of the next hill, I saw a thick wood spreading wide and black before me. I hesitated at this. I could see no end to it, either to the right or the left. Feeling tired, my feet in particular were very sore. I carefully lowered Wiener from my shoulder as I halted and sat down upon the turf. I could no longer see the palace of green porcelain, and I was in doubt of my direction. I looked into the thickness of the wood and thought of what it might hide under that dense tangle of branches. One will be out of sight of the stars. Even were there no other lurking danger, a danger I did not care to let my imagination loose upon. There would still be all the roots to stumble over and the tree boles to strike against. I was very tired too, after the excitement of the day, so I decided that I would not face it, but would pass the night upon the open hill. Wiener, I was glad to find, was fast asleep. I carefully wrapped her in my jacket and sat down beside her to wait for the moonrise. The hillside was quiet and deserted, but from the black of the wood they came now and then a stir of living things. Above me shone the stars, for the night was very clear. I felt a certain sense of friendly comfort in their twinkling. All the old constellations had gone from the sky. However, that slow movement, which is imperceptible in 100 human lifetimes, had long since rearranged them in unfamiliar groupings. But the Milky Way, it seemed to me, was still the same tattered streamer of stardust. As of yore, southward as I judged, it was a very bright red star that was new to me. It was even more splendid than our own green Sirius, And amid all these scintillating points of light, one bright planet shone kindly and steadily, like the face of an old friend looking at these stars. Suddenly dwarfed my own troubles and all the gravities of terrestrial life. I thought of their unfathomable distance and the slow, inevitable drift of their movements out of the unknown past into the unknown future. I thought of the great processional cycle that the pole of the earth describes. Only 40 times had that silent revolution occurred. During all the years that I had traversed, and during these few revolutions, all the activity, all the traditions, the complex organizations, the nation's languages, literature's aspirations, even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Instead were these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry and the white things of which I went in terror. Then I thought of the great fear that was between the two species, and for the first time, with a sudden shiver, came the clear knowledge of what the meat I had seen might be, yet it was too horrible. I looked at little Wiener sleeping beside me, her face white and star-like under the stars, and forthwith dismissed the thought. Through that long night, I held my mind off the Morlocks as well as I could, and whiled away the time by trying to fancy I could find signs of the old constellations in the new confusion. The sky kept very clear except for a hazy cloud or so. No doubt I dozed at times. Then as my vigil wore on, came a faintness in the eastward sky, like the reflection of some colorless fire, and the old moon rose, thin and peaked and white and close behind, and overtaking it and overflowing it. The dawn came pale at first, and then growing pink and warm. No Morlocks had approached us. Indeed, I had seen none upon the hill that night, and in the confidence of renewed day. It almost seemed to me that my fear had been unreasonable. I stood up and found my foot with the loose heels, swollen at the ankle and painful under the heel. So I sat down again, took off my shoes and flung them away. I awakened Wiener and we went down into the wood, now green and pleasant instead of black and forbidding. We found some fruit wherewith to break our fast. We soon met others of the dainty ones, laughing and dancing in the sunlight, as though there was no such thing in nature as the night. And then I thought once more of the meat that I had seen. I felt assured now of what it was, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied this last, feeble reel from the great flood of humanity. Clearly at some time in the long ago of human decay, the Morlocks' food had run short. Possibly they had lived on rats and such like vermin. Even now man is far less discriminating and exclusive in his food than he was far less than any monkey. His prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct, and so these inhuman sons of men. I tried to look at the thing in a scientific spirit. After all, they were less human and more remote than our cannibal ancestors of 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and the intelligence that would have made this state of things at torment had gone. Why should I trouble myself? These alloy were mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon. Probably so do the breeding of, and there was Wiener dancing at my side. Then I tried to preserve myself from the horror that was coming upon me by regarding it as a rigorous punishment of human selfishness. Man had been content to live in ease and delight upon the labors of his fellow man, had taken necessity as his watchword and excuse, and in the fullness of time, necessity had come home to him. I even tried a Carlyle, like scorn of this wretched aristocracy in decay, but this attitude of mine was impossible. However great their intellectual degradation, the alloy had kept too much of the human form not to claim my sympathy and to make me perforce a sharer in their degradation and their fear. I had at that time very vague ideas as to the course I should pursue. My first was to secure some safe place of refuge, and to make myself such arms of metal or stone as I could contrive that necessity was immediate. In the next place, I hoped to procure some means of fire, so that I should have the weapon of a torch at hand, for nothing I knew would be more efficient against these Morlocks. Then I wanted to arrange some contrivance to break open the doors of bronze. Under the white sphinx, I had in mind a battering ram. I had a persuasion that if I could enter those doors and carry a blaze of light before me, I should discover the time machine and escape. I could not imagine. The Morlocks were strong enough to move it far away. Wiener I had resolved to bring with me to our own time, and turning such schemes over in my mind, I pursued our way towards the building, which my fancy had chosen as our dwelling. Chapter 8. I found the palace of green porcelain. When we approached it about noon, deserted and falling into ruin, only ragged vestiges of glass remained in its windows, and great sheets of the green facing had fallen away from the corroded metallic framework. It lay very high up on a turfy down, and looking northeastward before I entered it, I was surprised to see a large estuary or even creek, where I judged Wandsworth and Battersea must once have been. I thought then, though I never followed up the thought of what might have happened, or might be happening to the living things in the sea. The material of the palace proved on examination to be indeed porcelain, and along the face of it I saw an inscription in some unknown character. I thought rather foolishly that Wiener might help me to interpret this, but I only learned that the bare idea of writing had never entered her head. She always seemed to me, I fancy, more human than she was, perhaps because her affection was so human. Within the big valves of the door, which were open and broken, we found, instead of the customary hall, a long gallery lit by many side windows. At the first glance, I was reminded of a museum. The tiled floor was thick with dust, and a remarkable array of miscellaneous objects was shrouded in the same gray covering. Then I perceived, standing strange and gaunt in the center of the hall, what was clearly the lower part of a huge skeleton. I recognized by the oblique feet that it was some extinct creature, after the fashion of the Megatherium. The skull and the upper bones lay beside it, in the thick dust, and in one place, where rainwater had dropped through a leak in the roof, the thing itself had been worn away. Further in the gallery was the huge skeleton barrel of a brontosaurus. My museum hypothesis was confirmed. Going towards the side, I found what appeared to be sloping shelves, and clearing away the thick dust, I found the old familiar glass cases of our own time, but they must have been airtight, to judge from the fair preservation of some of their contents. Clearly we stood among the ruins of some latter day. South Kensington here apparently was the paleontological section, and a very splendid array of fossils. It must have been, though, the inevitable process of decay that had been staved off for time, and had, through the extinction of bacteria and fungi, lost 99/100 of its force, was nevertheless with extreme sureness, if with extreme slowness, at work again upon all its treasures. Here and there I found traces of the little people, in the shape of rare fossils, broken to pieces or threaded in strings upon reeds, and the cases had, in some instances, been bodily removed by the Morlocks. As I judged, the place was very silent, the thick dust dead in the footsteps. Wiener, who had been rolling a sea urchin down the sloping glass of a case, presently came as I stared about me, and very quietly took my hand and stood beside me. And at first I was so much surprised by this ancient monument of an intellectual age that I gave no thought to the possibilities it presented. Even my preoccupation about the time machine receded a little from my mind, to judge from the size of the place. This palace of green porcelain had a great deal more in it than a gallery of paleontology. possibly historical galleries. It might be even a library. To me, at least in my present circumstances, these would be vastly more interesting than this spectacle of old-time geology in decay. Exploring, I found another short gallery. Running transversely to the first, this appeared to be devoted to minerals, and the sight of a block of sulfur set my mind running on gunpowder. But I could find no saltpeter, indeed no nitrates of any kind. Doubtless they had deliquesced ages ago. Yet the sulfur hung in my mind and set up a train of thinking. As for the rest of the contents of that gallery, though on the whole they were the best preserved of all I saw, I had little interest. I am no specialist in mineralogy, and I went on down a very ruinous aisle. Running parallel to the first hall I had entered, apparently, this section had been devoted to natural history. But everything had long since passed out of recognition. A few shriveled and blackened vestiges of what had once been stuffed animals, desiccated mummies in jars that had once held spirit, a brown dust of departed plants. That was all. I was sorry for that, because I should have been glad to trace the patent readjustments by which the conquest of animated nature had been attained. Then we came to a gallery of simply colossal proportions, but singularly ill-lit, the floor a bit running downward at a slight angle, from the end of which I entered. At intervals white globes hung from the ceiling, many of them cracked and smashed, which suggested that originally the place had been artificially lit. Here I was more in my element, for rising on either side of me were the huge bulks of big machines, all greatly corroded and many broken down, but some still fairly complete. You know, I have a certain weakness for mechanism, and I was inclined to linger among these the more so, as for the most part they had the interest of puzzles, and I could make only the vague guesses at what they were for. I fancied that if I could solve their puzzles, I should find myself in possession of powers that might be of use against the Morlocks. Suddenly Wiener came very close to my side, so suddenly that she startled me. Had it not been for her, I do not think I should have noticed that the floor of the gallery sloped at all. Footnote: it may be, of course, that the floor did not slope, but that the museum was built into the side of a hill. Editor: the end I had come in at was quite above ground, and was lit by rare slit-like windows. As you went down the length, the ground came up against these windows, until at last there was a pit, like the area of a London house, before each, and only a narrow line of daylight at the top. I went slowly along, puzzling about the machines, and had been too intent upon them to notice the gradual diminution of the light, until Wiener's increasing apprehensions drew my attention. Then I saw that the gallery ran down, at last, into a thick darkness. I hesitated, and then as I looked around me, I saw that the dust was less abundant, and its surface less, even further away towards the dimness. It appeared to be broken by a number of small, narrow footprints. My sense of the immediate presence of the Morlocks revived. That I felt that I was wasting my time in the academic examination of machinery. I called to mind that it was already far advanced in the afternoon, and that I had still no weapon, no refuge, and no means of making a fire. And then down in the remote blackness of the gallery, I heard a peculiar pattern, and the same odd noises I had heard down the well. I took Wiener's hand, then struck with a sudden idea, I left her and turned to a machine from which projected a lever, not unlike those in a signal box, clambering upon the stand, and grasping this lever in my hands, I put all my weight upon it sideways. Suddenly Wiener, deserted in the central aisle, began to whimper. I had judged the strength of the lever pretty correctly, for it snapped after a minute's strain, and I rejoined her with a mace in my hand, more than sufficient, I judged, for any Morlock skull I might encounter. And I longed very much to kill a Morlock, or so very inhuman you may think. to want to go killing one's own descendants. But it was impossible somehow to feel any humanity in the things, only my disinclination to leave Wiener. And persuasion that if I began to sleek, my thirst for murder my time machine might suffer, restrained me from going straight down the gallery and killing the brutes I heard, Wellmace in one hand and Wiener in the other. I went out of that gallery and into another, and still larger one which, at the first glance, reminded me of a military chapel, hung with tattered flags, the brown and charred, rags that hung from the sides of it. I presently recognized as the decaying vestiges of books. They had long since dropped to pieces, and every semblance of print had left them, but here and there were warped boards and cracked metallic clasps that told the tale well enough. Had I been a literary man, I might perhaps have moralized upon the futility of all ambition. But as it was, the thing that struck me with keenest force was the enormous waste of labor, to which this somber wilderness of rotting paper testified. At the time, I will confess that I thought chiefly of the philosophical transactions and my own 17 papers upon physical optics. Then going up a broad staircase, we came to what may once have been a gallery of technical chemistry, and here I had not a little hope of useful discoveries. Except at one end where the roof had collapsed, this gallery was well preserved. I went eagerly to every unbroken case, and at last in one of the really airtight cases, I found a box of matches. Very eagerly the first tried them. They were perfectly good, they were not even damp. I turned to Wiener Dance. I cried to her in her own tongue. For now I had a weapon indeed, against the horrible creatures we feared. And so, in that derelict museum, upon the thick soft carpeting of dust, to Wiener's huge delight, I solemnly performed a kind of composite dance, whistling the Land of the Lella as cheerfully as I could. In part it was a modest can-can, in part a step dance and part a skirt dance, so far as my tailcoat permitted, and in part original, for I am naturally inventive, as you know. Now I still think that for this box of matches to have escaped the wear of time for immemorial years was a most strange, as for me it was a most fortunate thing. Yet oddly enough, I found a far unlikelier substance, and that was camphor. I found it in a sealed jar that by chance, I suppose, had been really hermetically sealed. I fainted at first that it was paraffin wax, and smashed the glass accordingly. But the odor of camphor was unmistakable in the universal decay. This volatile substance had chanced to survive, perhaps through many thousands of centuries. It reminded me of a CPR painting I had once seen, done from the ink of a fossil belemnite that must have perished and become fossilized. Millions of years ago I was about to throw it away, but I remembered that it was inflammable and burned with a good bright flame, was in fact an excellent candle, and I put it in my pocket. I found no explosives, however, nor any means of breaking down the bronze doors. As yet my iron crowbar was the most helpful thing I had chanced upon. Nevertheless, I left that gallery greatly elated. I cannot tell you all the story of that long afternoon. It would require a great effort of memory to recall my explorations in at all the proper order. I remember a long gallery of rusting stands of arms, and how I hesitated between my crowbar and a hatchet, or a sword. I could not carry both, however, and my bar of iron promised best. Against the bronze gates there were numbers of guns, pistols and rifles. The most were masses of rust, but many were of some new metal and still fairly sound. But any cartridges or powder there may once have been had rotted into dust. One corner I saw was charred, perhaps, I thought, by an explosion among the specimens. In another place was a vast array of idols, Polynesian, Mexican, Grecian, Phoenician, every country on earth, I should think. And here, yielding to an irresistible impulse, I wrote my name upon the nose of a steer-eyed monster, from South America that particularly took my fancy. As the evening drew on, my interest waned. I went through gallery after gallery, dusty, silent, often ruiners. The exhibit sometimes mere heaps of rust and ignite, sometimes fresher in one place. I suddenly found myself near the model of a tin mine, and then by the nearest accident, I discovered in an airtight case, to dynamite cartridges. I shouted "Eureka!" and smashed the case with joy. Then came a doubt. I hesitated. Then, selecting a little side gallery, I made my essay. I never felt such a disappointment as I did in waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for an explosion that never came. Of course, the things were dummies, as I might have guessed from their presence. I really believe that had they not been so, I should have rushed off incontinently and blown Sphinx, bronze doors, and as it proved, my chances of finding the time machine altogether into non-existence. It was after that, I think, that we came to a little open court within the palace. It was turfed and had fruit trees, so we rested and refreshed ourselves. Towards sunset, I began to consider our position. Night was creeping upon us, and my inaccessible hiding place had still to be found. But that troubled me very little. Now I had in my possession a thing that was perhaps the best of all defenses against the Morlocks. I had matches. I had the camper in my pocket too. If a blaze were needed, it seemed to me that the best thing we could do would be to pass the night in the open, protected by a fire. In the morning, there was the getting of the time machine. Towards that, as yet, I had only my iron mace. But now, with my growing knowledge, I felt very differently towards those bronze doors. Up to this, I had refrained from forcing them, largely because of the mystery on the other side. They had never impressed me as being very strong, and I hoped to find my bar of iron not altogether inadequate for the work. Chapter 9. We emerged from the palace while the sun was still. In part above the horizon, I was determined to reach the White Sphinx. Early the next morning, and ere the dusk, I purposed pushing through the woods that had stopped me on the previous journey. My plan was to go as far as possible that night, and then building a fire to sleep in the protection of its glare. Accordingly, as we went along, I gathered any sticks or dried grass I saw, and presently had my arms full of such litter. Thus loaded, our progress was slower than I had anticipated, and besides, Wiener was tired and I began to suffer from sleepiness, so that it was full night before we reached the wood. Upon the shrubby hill of its edge, Wiener would have stopped, fearing the darkness before us, but a singular sense of impending calamity that should indeed have served me as a warning drove me onward. I had been without sleep for a night and 2 days, and I was feverish and irritable. I felt sleep coming upon me, and the Morlocks with it, while we hesitated among the black bushes behind us. And dim against their blackness, I saw 3 crouching figures. There was scrub and long grass all about us, and I did not feel safe from their insidious approach. The forest, I calculated, was rather less than a mile across. If we could get through it to the bare hillside there, as it seemed to me, was an altogether safer resting place. I thought that with my matches and my camper, I could contrive to keep my path illuminated through the woods, yet it was evident that if I was to flourish matches with my hands, I should have to abandon my firewood. So rather reluctantly I put it down, and then it came into my head that I would amaze our friends behind by lighting it. I was to discover the atrocious folly of this proceeding, but it came to my mind as an ingenious move for covering our retreat. I don't know if you have ever thought what a rare thing flame must be. In the absence of man and in a temperate climate, the sun's heat is rarely strong enough to burn, even when it is focused by dewdrops. As is sometimes the case in more tropical districts, lightning may blast and blacken, but it rarely gives rise to widespread fire. Decaying vegetation may occasionally smolder with the heat of its fermentation, but this rarely results in flame. In this decadence too, the art of fire making had been forgotten on the earth. The red tongues that went licking up my heap of wood were an altogether new and strange thing. To Wiener, she wanted to run to it and play with it. I believe she would have cast herself into it had I not restrained her. But I caught her up, and in spite of her struggles, plunged boldly before me into the wood. For a little way the glare of my fire lit the path. Looking back presently, I could see through the crowded stems that, from my heap of sticks, the blaze had spread to some bushes adjacent, and a curved line of fire was creeping up the grass of the hill. I laughed at that, and turned again to the dark trees before me. It was very black, and Wiener clung to me convulsively, but there was still. As my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, sufficient light for me to avoid the stems. Overhead it was simply black, except where a gap of remote blue sky shone down upon us, here and there. I struck none of my matches, because I had no hand free. Upon my left arm I carried my little one. In my right hand I had my iron bar. For some way, I heard nothing but the crackling twigs under my feet, the faint rustle of the breeze above, and my own breathing, and the throb of the blood vessels in my ears. Then I seemed to know of a pattering about me. I pushed on grimly. The pattering grew more distinct, and then I caught the same queer sound and voices I had heard. In the underworld, there were evidently several of the Morlocks, and they were closing in upon me. Indeed, in another minute, I felt a tug at my coat, then something at my arm, and Wiener shivered violently and became quite still. It was time for a match, but to get one, I must put her down. I did so, and as I fumbled with my pocket, a struggle began in the darkness about my knees, perfectly silent on her part, and with the same peculiar cooing sounds from the Morlocks. Soft little hands, too, were creeping over my coat and back, touching even my neck. Then the match scratched and fizzed. I held it flaring, and saw the white backs of the Morlocks in flight. Amid the trees, I hastily took a lump of camphor from my pocket, and prepared to light it as soon as the match should wane. Then I looked at Wiener. She was lying, clutching my feet and quite motionless, with her face to the ground. With a sudden fright I stooped to her. She seemed scarcely to breathe. I lit the block of camphor and flung it to the ground, and as it split and flared up and drove back the Morlocks and the shadows, I knelt down and lifted her. The wood behind seemed full of the stir and murmur of a great company. She seemed to have fainted. I put her carefully upon my shoulder and rose to push on. And then there came a horrible realization. In maneuvering with my matches and Wiener, I had turned myself about several times, and now I had not the faintest idea in what direction lay my path. For all I knew, I might be facing back towards the palace of green porcelain. I found myself in a cold sweat. I had to think rapidly what to do. I determined to build a fire and encamp where we were. I put Wiener, still motionless, down upon a turfy bowl, and very hastily, as my first lump of camphor waned, I began collecting sticks and leaves here and there. Out of the darkness around me, the Morlock's eyes shone like carbuncles. The camphor flickered and went out. I lit a match, and as I did so, two white forms that have been approaching Wiener dashed hastily away. One was so blinded by the light that he came straight for me, and I felt his bones grind under the blow of my fist. He gave a whoop of dismay, staggered a little way, and fell down. I lit another piece of camphor and went on gathering my bonfire. Presently, I noticed how dry was some of the foliage above me. For since my arrival on the time machine, a matter of a week, no rain had fallen. So instead of casting about among the trees for fallen twigs, I began leaping up and dragging down branches. Very soon I had a choking, smoky fire of green wood and dry sticks, and could economize my camper. Then I turned to where Wiener lay beside my iron mace. I tried what I could to revive her, but she lay like one dead. I could not even satisfy myself. Whether or not she breathed, now the smoke of the fire beat over towards me, and it must have made me heavy of a sudden. Moreover, the vapor of camphor was in the air. My fire would not need replenishing for an hour or so. I felt very weary after my exertion and sat down. The wood, too, was full of a slumberous murmur that I did not understand. I seemed just to nod and open my eyes, but all was dark, and the Morlocks had their hands upon me, flinging off their clinging fingers. I hastily felt in my pocket for the matchbox, and it had gone. Then they gripped and closed with me again. In a moment I knew what had happened. I had slept, and my fire had gone out, and the bitterness of death came over my soul. The forest seemed full of the smell of burning wood. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. It was indescribably horrible in the darkness to feel all these soft creatures heaped upon me. I felt as if I was in a monstrous spider's web. I was overpowered and went down. I felt little teeth nipping at my neck. I rolled over, and as I did so, my hand came against my iron lever. It gave me strength. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me and holding the bar short. I thrust where I judged their faces might be. I could feel the succulent giving of flesh and bone under my blows, and for a moment I was free. The strange exaltation that so often seems to accompany hard fighting came upon me. I knew that both I and Wiener were lost, but I determined to make the Morlocks pay for their meat. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of the stirred, and cries of them. A minute passed. Their voices seemed to rise to a higher pitch of excitement, and their movements grew faster. Yet none came within reach. I stood glaring at the blackness. Then suddenly came hope. What if the Morlocks were afraid and close? On the heels of that came a strange thing. The darkness seemed to grow luminous very dimly. I began to see the Morlocks about me, 3 battered at my feet, and then I recognized with incredulous surprise that the others were running in an incessant stream, as it seemed, from behind me and away through the wood in front, and their back seems no longer white but reddish. As I stood agape, I saw a little red spark go, drifting across a gap of starlight between the branches, and vanish. And at that I understood the smell of burning wood, the slumberous murmur that was growing now into a gusty roar, the red glow and the Morlock's flight, stepping out from behind my tree and looking back. I saw through the black pillars of the nearer trees the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire coming after me. With that I looked for Wiener, but she was gone. The hissing and crackling behind me, the explosive fun as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for reflection. My iron bar still gripped. I followed in the Morlock's path. It was a close race once. The flames crept forward so swiftly on my right. As I ran that I was outflanked and had to strike off to the left. But at last I emerged upon a small open space, and as I did so, a Morlock came blundering towards me and past me, and went on straight into the fire. And now I was to see the most weird and horrible thing. I think of all that I beheld in that future age. This whole space was as bright as day. With the reflection of the fire, in the center was a helix, or tumulus surmounted by a scorched hawthorn. Beyond this was another arm of the burning forest, with yellow tongues already rising from it, completely encircling the space with a fence of fire. Upon the hillside was some 30 or 40 Morlocks, dazzled by the light and heat, and blundering hither and thither against each other. In their bewilderment at first, I did not realize their blindness, and struck furiously at them with my bar. In a frenzy of fear as they approached me, killing one and crippling several more. But when I had watched the gestures of one of them, groping under the hawthorn against the red sky, and heard their moans, I was assured of their absolute helplessness and misery in the glare, and I struck no more of them hit. Every now and then one would come straight towards me, setting loose quivering horror that made me quick to elude him. At one time the flames died down somewhat, and I feared the foul creatures would presently be able to see me. I was thinking of beginning the fight by killing some of them before this should happen, but the fire burst out again brightly, and I stayed my hand. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Wiener, but Wiener was gone. At last I sat down on the summit of the hillock and watched this strange, incredible company of blind things groping to and fro and making uncanny noises to each other as the glare of the fire beat on them. The coiling up rush of smoke streamed across the sky, and through the rare taters of that red canopy, remote as though they belonged to another universe, shone the little stars. 2 or 3 Morlocks came blundering into me, and I drove them off with blows of my fists, trembling as I did so. For the most part of that night, I was persuaded it was a nightmare. I bit myself and screamed in a passionate desire to awake. I beat the ground with my hands and got up and sat down again and wandered here and there, and again sat down. Then I would falter, rubbing my eyes and calling upon God to let me awake. Thrice I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a kind of agony and rush into the flames. But at last, above the subsiding red of the fire, above the streaming masses of black smoke, and the whitening and blackening tree stumps, and the diminishing numbers of these dim creatures, came the white light of the day. I searched again for traces of Wiener, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. I cannot describe how it relieved me to think that it had escaped the awful fate to which it seemed destined. As I thought of that, I was almost moved to begin a massacre of the helpless abominations about me. But I contained myself. The hillock, as I have said, was a kind of island in the forest. From its summit, I could now make out through a haze of smoke the palace of green porcelain, and from that I could get my bearings for the wide swings, and so leaving the remnant of these damned souls still going hither and moaning. As the day grew clearer, I tied some grass about my feet and limped on across smoking ashes and among black stems that still pulsated internally with fire towards the hiding place of the time machine. I walked slowly, for I was almost exhausted as well as lame, and I felt the intensest wretchedness. For the horrible death of little Wiener, it seemed an overwhelming calamity. Now in this old familiar room, it is more like the sorrow of a dream than an actual loss. But that morning it left me absolutely lonely again. Terribly alone, I began to think of this house of mine, of this fireside of some of you, and with such thoughts came a longing that was pain. But as I walked over the smoking ashes, under the bright morning sky, I made a discovery. In my trouser pocket were still some loose matches. The box must have leaked before it was lost. Chapter 10. About 8 or 9 in the morning, I came to the same seat of yellow metal from which I had viewed the world upon the evening of my arrival. I thought of my hasty conclusions upon that evening and could not refrain from laughing bitterly at my confidence. Here was the same beautiful scene, the same abundant foliage, the same splendid palaces and magnificent ruins, the same silver river running between its fertile banks. The gay robes of the beautiful people moved hither and hither among the trees. Some were bathing in exactly the place where I had saved Wiener, and that suddenly gave me a keen stab of pain, and like blots upon the landscape rose the cupolas above the ways to the underworld, I understood now what all the beauty of the overworld people covered. Very pleasant was their day. As present as the day of the cattle in the field, like the cattle. They knew of no enemies and provided against no needs. And their end was the same. I grieved to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It committed suicide. It had set itself steadfastly towards comfort and ease. A balanced society, with security and permanency as its watchword. It had attained its hopes. To come to this at last, one's life and property must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich had been assured of his wealth and comfort. The toiler assured of his life and work. No doubt in that perfect world, there had been no unemployed problem. No social question left unsolved, and a great quiet had followed. It is a law of nature we overlook, that intellectual versatility is the compensation for change, danger, and trouble. An animal perfectly in harmony with its environment is a perfect mechanism. Nature never appeals to intelligence. Until habit and instinct are useless, there is no intelligence where there is no change. And no need of change, only those animals partake of intelligence that have to meet a huge variety of needs and dangers. So as I see it, the upper world, man had drifted towards his feeble prettiness, and the underworld to mere mechanical industry. But that perfect state had lacked one thing. Even for mechanical perfection, absolute permanency, apparently as time went on. The feeding of the underworld, however it was effected, had become disjointed. Mother Necessity, who had been staved off for a few thousand years, came back again, and she began below the underworld, being in contact with machinery which, however perfect, still needs some little thought. Outside habit had probably retained for force, rather more initiative, if less of every other human character than the upper, and when other meat failed them, they turned to what old habit had hitherto forbidden. So I say, I saw it in my last view of the world of 800 to 1701. It may be as wrong an explanation as mortal wit could invent. It is how the thing shaped itself to me, and as that I give it to you now, after the fatigues, excitement, and terrors of the past days, and in spite of my grief. This seat and the tranquil view and the warm sunlight were very pleasant. I was very tired and sleepy, and soon my theorizing passed into dozing. Catching myself at that, I took my own hint, and spreading myself out upon the turf. I had a long and refreshing sleep. I awoke a little before sun setting. I now felt safe against being caught, napping by the Morlocks and stretching myself. I came on down the hill towards the White Sphinx. I had my crowbar in one hand, and the other hand played with the matches in my pocket. And now came a most unexpected thing. As I approached the pedestal of the Sphinx, I found the bronze valves were open. They had slid down into grooves. At that I stopped short before them, hesitating to enter. Within was a small apartment, and on a raised place in the corner of this was the time machine. I had the small levers in my pocket. So here, after all my elaborate preparations for the siege of the White Sphinx, was a meek surrender. I threw my iron bar away, almost sorry not to use it. A sudden thought came into my head. As I stooped towards the portal, for once at least, I grasped the mental operations of the Morlocks. Suppressing a strong inclination to laugh, I stepped through the bronze frame and up to the time machine. I was surprised to find it had been carefully oiled and cleaned. I have suspected since that the Morlocks had even partially taken it to pieces, while trying in their dim way to grasp its purpose. Now as I stood and examined it, finding a pleasure in the mere touch of the contrivance, the thing I had expected happened. The bronze panel suddenly slid up and struck the frame with a clang. I was in the dark, trapped, so the Morlocks thought. At that I chuckled gleefully. I could already hear their murmuring laughter. As they came towards me, very calmly I tried to strike the match. I had only to fix on the levers and depart. then like a ghost, but I had overlooked one little thing. The matches were of that abominable kind that light only on the box. You may imagine how all my calm vanished. The little brutes were close upon me. One touched me, I made a sweeping blow in the dark at them with the levers and began to scramble into the saddle of the machine. Then came one hand upon me, and then another. Then I had simply to fight against their persistent fingers for my levers, and at the same time feel for the studs over which these fitted. One indeed, they almost got away from me. As it slipped from my hand, I had to butt in the dark with my head. I could hear the Morlock skull ring to recover it. It was a nearer thing than the fight in the forest. I think this last scramble, but at last the lever was fitted and pulled over. The clinging hands slipped from me. The darkness presently fell from my eyes. I found myself in the same gray light and tumult I have already described. Chapter 11. I have already told you of the sickness and confusion that comes with time. Traveling at this time, I was not seated properly in the saddle, but sideways and in an unstable fashion for an indefinite time. I clunged the machine as it swayed and vibrated, quite unheeding how I went. And when I brought myself to look at the dials again, I was amazed to find where I had arrived. One dial records days and another thousands of days, another millions of days, and another thousands of millions. Now instead of reversing the levers, I had pulled them over so as to go forward with them. And when I came to look at these indicators, I found that the thousands hand was sweeping round as fast as the seconds hand of a watch into futurity as I drove on. A peculiar change crept over the appearance of things. The palpitating grayness grew darker. Then, though I was still traveling with prodigious velocity, the blinking succession of day and night, which was usually indicative of a slower pace, returned and grew more and more marked. This puzzled me very much at first. The alternations of night and day grew slower and slower, and so did the passage of the sun across the sky, until they seemed to stretch through centuries. At last a steady twilight brooded over the earth, a twilight only broken now and then when a comet glared across the darkling sky. The band of light that had indicated the sun had long since disappeared, for the sun had ceased to set. It simply rose and fell in the west and grew ever broader and more red. All trace of the moon had vanished. The circling of the stars, growing slower and slower, had given place to creeping points of light. At last, some time before I stopped, the sun, red and very large, halted motionless. Upon the horizon a vast dome glowing with a dull heat, and now and then suffering a momentary extinction at one time. It had for a little while glowed more brilliantly again, but it speedily reverted to its sullen red heat. I perceived, by the slowing down of its rising and setting, that the work of the tidal drag was done. The earth had come to rest with one face to the sun. Even as in our own time, the moon faces the earth very cautiously. For I remembered my former headlong fall, I began to reverse my motion. Slower and slower went the circling hands, until the thousands one seemed motionless, and the daily one was no longer a mere mist upon its scale, still slower, until the dim outlines of a desolate beach grew visible. I stopped very gently and sat upon the time machine. Looking around, the sky was no longer blue. Northeastward it was inky black, and out of the blackness shined brightly and steadily the pale white stars. Overhead it was a deep Indian red and starless, and southeastward it grew brighter to a glowing scarlet. Where cut by the horizon lay the huge hull of the sun. Red and motionless, the rocks about me were of a harsh reddish color, and all the trace of life that I could see at first was the intensely green vegetation that covered every projecting point on their southeastern face. It was the same rich green that one sees on forest moss or on the lichen in caves. plants which like these grow in a perpetual twilight. The machine was standing on a sloping beach. The sea stretched away to the southwest, to rise into a sharp, bright horizon against the one sky. There were no breakers and no waves, for not a breath of wind was stirring. Only a slight oily swell rose and fell, like a gentle breathing, and showed that the eternal sea was still moving and living. And along the margin where the water sometimes broke, was a thick incrustation of salt pink under the lurid sky. There was a sense of oppression in my head, and I noticed that I was breathing very fast. The sensation reminded me of my only experience of mountaineering, and from that, I judged the air to be more rarefied than it is now. Far away up the desolate slope, I heard a harsh scream and sort of thing like a huge, white butterfly goes slanting and fluttering up into the sky, and circling disappear over some low helix beyond. The sound of its voice was so dismal that I shivered, and seated myself more firmly upon the machine. Looking around me again, I saw that quite near, what I had taken to be a reddish mass of rock was moving slowly towards me. Then I saw the thing was really a monstrous, crab-like creature. Can you imagine a crab as large as yonder table, with its many legs moving slowly and uncertainly, its big claws swaying, its long antennae like carter's whips, waving and feeling, and its storked eyes gleaming at you? On either side of its metallic front, its back was corrugated and ornamented with ungainly bosses, and a greenish incrustation blotched it here and there. I could see the many pulps of its complicated mouth, flickering and feeling as it moved. As I stared at this sinister apparition, crawling towards me, I felt a tickling on my cheek, as though a fly had lighted there. I tried to brush it away with my hand, but in a moment it returned, and almost immediately came another by my ear. I struck at this and caught something thread-like. It was drawn swiftly out of my hand. With a frightful qualm I turned, and I saw that I had grasped the antenna of another monster crab that stood just behind me. Its evil eyes were wriggling on their stalks. Its mouth was all alive with appetite, and its vast ungainly claws, smeared with an algal slime, were descending upon me in a moment. My hand was on the lever, and I had placed a month between myself and these monsters, but I was still on the same beach, and I saw them distinctly now as soon as I stopped. Dozens of them seemed to be crawling here and there. In the somber light, among the foliated sheets of intense green, I cannot convey the sense of abominable desolation that hung over the world. The red eastern sky, the northward blackness, the salt Dead Sea, the stony beach crawling with these fowls, slow-stirring monsters, the uniform, poisonous-looking green of the lichenous plants, the thin air that hurts one's lungs, all contributed to an appalling effect. I moved on 100 years, and there was the same red sun, a little larger, a little duller, the same dying sea, the same chill air, and the same crowd of earthy crustacean creeping in and out, among the green weed and the red rocks, and in the westward sky. I saw a curved pale line like a vast new moon, so I traveled, stopping ever and again, in great strides of 1,000 years or more, drawn on by the mystery of the earth's fate, watching with a strange fascination the sun grow larger and duller in the westward sky, and the life of the old earth ever way, at last more than 30 million years hence. The huge red-hot dome of the sun had come to obscure nearly a 10th part of the darkling heavens. Then I stopped once more, for the crawling multitude of crabs had disappeared, and the red beach, save for its livid green liverworts and lichens, seemed lifeless. And now it was flecked with white. A bitter cold assailed me, rare white flakes ever, and again came eddying down to the northeastward. The glare of snow lay under the starlight of the sable sky, and I could see an undulating crest of helix, pinkish white. There were fringes of ice along the sea margin, with drifting masses further out, but the main expanse of that salt ocean, all bloody under the eternal sunset, was still unfrozen. I looked about me to see if any traces of animal life remained. A certain indefinable apprehension still kept me in the saddle of the machine, but I saw nothing moving in earth or sky or sea. The green slime on the rocks alone testified that life was not extinct. A shallow sandbank had appeared in the sea, and the water had receded from the beach, I fancied. I saw some black object flopping about upon this bank, but it became motionless as I looked at it, and I judged that my eye had been deceived, and that the black object was merely a rock. The stars in the sky were intensely bright, and seemed to me to twinkle very little. Suddenly I noticed that the circular, westward outline of the sun had changed, that a concavity, a bay, had appeared in the curve. I saw this grow larger. For a minute perhaps, I stared. August to this blackness that was creeping over the day, and then I realized that an eclipse was beginning. Either the moon or the planet Mercury was passing across the sun's disk. Naturally, at first, I took it to be the moon, but there is much to incline me to believe that. What I really saw was the transit of an inner planet passing very near to the Earth. The darkness grew apace. A cold wind began to blow in, freshening gusts from the east, and the showering, white flakes in the air increased in number. From the edge of the sea came a ripple and whisper. Beyond these lifeless sounds, the world was silent, silent. It would be hard to convey the stillness of it all. The sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives. All that was over as the darkness thickened. The eddying flakes grew more abundant, dancing before my eyes, and the cold of the air more intense. At last, one by one, swiftly one after the other, the white peaks of the distant hills vanished into blackness. The breeze rose to a moaning wind. I saw the black, central shadow of the eclipse sweeping towards me. In another moment, the pale stars alone were visible. All else was rayless obscurity. The sky was absolutely black. A horror of this great darkness came on me. The cold that smoked my marrow and the pain I felt in breathing overcame me. I shivered and a deadly nausea seized me. Then, like a red-hot bow in the sky, appeared the edge of the sun. I got off the machine to recover myself. I felt giddy and incapable of facing the return journey. As I stood sick and confused, I saw again the moving thing upon the shoal. There was no mistake now that it was a moving thing against the red water of the sea. It was a round thing the size of a football perhaps, or it may be bigger, and tentacles trailed down from it. It seemed black against the weltering blood-red water, and it was hopping fitfully about. Then I felt I was fainting, but a terrible dread of lying helpless in that remote and awful twilight sustained me while I clambered upon the saddle. Chapter 12. So I came back. For a long time, I must have been insensible upon the machine. The blinking succession of the days and nights was resumed. The sun got golden again, the sky blue. I breathed with greater freedom. The fluctuating contours of the land ebbed and flowed. The hands spun backward upon the dials. At last I saw again the dim shadows of houses, the evidences of decadent humanity. These two changed and passed, and others came. Presently, when the million dial was at 0, I slackened speed. I began to recognize our own. Pretty and familiar architecture. The thousands' hand ran back to the starting point. The night and day flapped slower and slower. Then the old walls of the laboratory came round me. Very gently now I slowed the mechanism down. I saw one little thing that seemed odd to me. I think I have told you that when I set out, before my velocity became very high, Mrs. Watchard had walked across the room traveling, as it seemed to me, like a rocket. As I returned, I passed again across that minute when she traversed the laboratory. But now her Every motion appeared to be the exact inversion of her previous ones. The door at the lower end opened, and she glided quietly up the laboratory, back foremost, and disappeared behind the door by which she had previously entered. Just before that, I seemed to see Helia for a moment, but he passed like a flash. Then I stopped the machine and saw about me again. The old familiar laboratory, my tools, my appliances, just as I had left them. I got off the thing very shakily and sat down upon my bench. For several minutes I trembled violently. Then I became calmer. Around me was my old workshop again. Exactly as it had been. I might have slept there, and the whole thing have been a dream, and yet not exactly. The thing had started from the southeast corner of the laboratory. It had come to rest again in the northwest, against the wall where you saw it. That gives you the exact distance from my little lawn to the pedestal of the White Sphinx, into which the Morlocks had carried my machine. For a time my brain went stagnant. Presently I got up and came through the passage here, limping because my heel was still painful and feeling sorely begrimed. I saw the Pall Mall Gazette on the table by the door. I found the date was indeed today, and looking at the timepiece, saw the hour was almost 8 o'clock. I heard your voices and the clatter of plates. I hesitated. I felt so sick and weak. Then I sniffed good, wholesome meat and opened the door on you. You know the rest. I washed and dined. And now I am telling you the story I know, he said after a pause. That all this will be absolutely incredible to you, to me. The one incredible thing is that I am here tonight, in this old familiar room, looking into your friendly faces and telling you these strange adventures. He looked at the medical man. No, I cannot expect you to believe it. Take it as a lie or a prophecy. Say I dreamed it in the workshop. Consider, I have been speculating upon the destinies of our race until I have hatched this fiction. Treat my assertion of its truth as a mere stroke of art to enhance its interest, and taking it as a story. What do you think of it? He took up his pipe and began, in his older custom manner, to tap with it nervously upon the bars of the grate. There was a momentary stillness, then chairs began to creak, and shoes to scrape upon the carpet. I took my eyes off the time traveler's face, and looked round at his audience. They were in the dark, and little spots of color swam before them. The medical man seemed absorbed in the contemplation of our host. The editor was looking hard at the end of his cigar. The sixth, the journalist, fumbled for his watch. The others, as far as I remember, were motionless. The editor stood up with a sigh. What a pity it is you're not a writer of stories, he said, putting his hand on the time traveler's shoulder. You don't believe it? Well, I thought not. The time traveler turned to us. Where are the matches? He said. He lit one and spoke over his pipe, puffing. To tell you the truth, I hardly believe it myself, and yet. His eye fell with a mute inquiry upon the withered white flowers upon the little table. Then he turned over the hand holding his pipe, and I saw he was looking at some half-healed scars on his knuckles. The medical man rose, came to the lamp, and examined the flowers. The gynoecium's odd, he said. The psychologist leant forward to see, holding out his hand for a specimen. I'm hanged if it isn't 1:45, said the journalist. How should we get home? Plenty of cabs at the station, said the psychologist. It's a curious thing, said the medical man, but I certainly don't know the natural order of these flowers. May I have them? The time traveler hesitated. Then suddenly, certainly not. Where did you really get them? Said the medical man. The time traveler put his hand to his head. He spoke like one who was trying to keep hold of an idea that eluded him. They were put into my pocket by Wiener when I traveled into time. He stared around the room. I'm damned if it isn't all going. This room and you in the atmosphere of every day is too much for my memory that I ever make a time machine or a model of a time machine. Or is it all only a dream? They say life is a dream, a precious poor dream at times. But I can't stand another that won't fit its madness. And where did the dream come from? I must look at that machine, if there is one. He caught up the lamp swiftly and carried it. Flaring red through the door into the corridor, we followed him there. In the flickering light of the lamp was the machine. Sure enough, squat, ugly, and askew, a thing of brass. Ebony, ivory, and translucent glimmering quartz. Solid to the touch, for I put out my hand and felt the rail of it, and with brown spots and smears upon the ivory, and bits of grass and moss upon the lower parts, and one rail bent awry. The time traveler put the lamp down on the bench and ran his hand along the damaged rail. "It's all right now," he said. "The story I told you is true. I'm sorry to have brought you out here in the cold." He took up the lamp, and in an absolute silence, we returned to the smoking room. He came into the hall with us and helped the editor on with his coat. The medical man looked into his face and, with a certain hesitation, told him he was suffering from overwork, and which he laughed hugely. I remember him standing in the open doorway, bawling good night. I shared a cab with the editor. He thought the tale a gaudy lie. For my own part, one was unable to come to a conclusion. The story was so fantastic and incredible, the telling so credible and sober. I lay awake most of the night thinking about it. I determined to go next day and see the time traveler again. I was told he was in the laboratory and being on easy terms in the house. I went up to him. The laboratory, however, was empty. I stared for a minute at the time machine and put out my hand and touched the lever. At that, the squat, substantial-looking mass swayed like a bow. Shaken by the wind, its instability startled me extremely, and I had a queer reminiscence of the childish days when I used to be forbidden to meddle. I came back through the corridor. The time traveler met me in the smoking room. He was coming from the house. He had a small camera under one arm and a knapsack under the other. He laughed when he saw me and gave me an elbow to shake. "I'm frightfully busy," said he, "with that thing in there, but is it not some hoax?" I said, "Do you really travel through time?" "Really and truly I do," and he looked frankly into my eyes. He hesitated as I wandered about the room. "I only want half an hour," he said. "I know why you came, and it's awfully good of you. There's some magazines here, if you're stopped to lunch. I'll prove you this time traveling up to the hilt. Specimen at all, if you'll forgive my leaving you now." I consented, hardly comprehending then the full import of his words, and he nodded and went on down the corridor. I heard the door of the laboratory slam, seated myself in a chair and took up a daily paper. What was he going to do before lunchtime? Then suddenly I was reminded by an advertisement that I had promised to meet Richardson, the publisher, at 2. I looked at my watch and saw that I could barely save that engagement. I got up and went down the passage to tell the time traveler. As I took hold of the handle of the door, I heard an exclamation oddly truncated at the end, and a click and a thud. A gust of air whirled around me as I opened the door, and from within came the sound of broken glass falling on the floor. The time traveler was not there. I seemed to see a ghostly, indistinct figure, sitting in a whirling mass of black and brass. For a moment, a figure so transparent that the bench behind, with the sheets of drawings, was absolutely distinct. But this phantasm vanished as I rubbed my eyes. The time machine had gone, save for a subsiding stir of dust. The further end of the laboratory was empty, a pane of. The skylight had apparently just been blown in. I felt an unreasonable amazement. I knew that something strange had happened, and for the moment, could not distinguish what the strange thing might be. As I stood staring, the door into the garden opened, and the manservant appeared. We looked at each other, then ideas began to come. "Has Mr. gone out that way?" said I. "No, sir. No one has come out this way." I was expecting to find him here. At that I understood. At the risk of disappointing Richardson, I stayed on waiting for the time traveler, waiting for the second, perhaps still stranger story, and the specimens and photographs he would bring with him. But I am beginning now to fear that I must wait a lifetime. The time traveler vanished 3 years ago, and as everybody knows now, he has never returned. Epilogue. One cannot choose but wonder. Will he ever return? It may be that he swept back into the past and fell among the blood-drinking, hairy savages of the age of unpolished stone, into the abysses of the Cretaceous Sea, or among the grotesque saurians, the huge reptilian broods of the Jurassic times. He may even now, if I may use the phrase, be wandering on some plesiosaurus, haunted Oolitic coral reef, or beside the lonely saline lakes of the Triassic Age. Or did he go forward into one of the nearer ages, in which men are still men, but with the riddles of our own time answered, and its wearisome problems solved, into the manhood of the race? For I, for my own part, cannot think that these latter days of weak experiment, fragmentary theory, and mutual discord are indeed man's culminating time. And I say for my own part, he I know. For the question had been discussed among us long before the time machine was made, thought but cheerlessly of the advancement of mankind, and saw in the growing pile of civilization only a foolish heaping that must inevitably fall back upon and destroy its makers in the end. If that is so, it remains for us to live as though it were not so. But to me, the future is still black and blank, is a vast ignorance, lit at a few casual places by the memory of his story. And I have by me for my comfort to strange white flowers, shriveled now and brown and flat and brittle, to witness that even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and a mutual tenderness still lived on. In the heart of man, the invisible man, a grotesque romance narrated by Sophie Okinato. Chapter 1: The Strange Man's Arrival. The stranger came early in February. One wintry day through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year, over the down walking from Bramblehurst railway station, and carrying a little black portmanteau in his stickly, gloved hand, he was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face, but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coaching horses, more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down. A fire, he cried in the name of human charity. A room and a fire. He stamped and shut the snow from off himself in the bar and followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlor to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, that in a couple of sovereign flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left him there, while she went to prepare him a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop at Ypeng in the wintertime was none heard of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggler, and she was resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well underway and Millie, her lymphatic maid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt, she carried the cloth, plates and glasses into the parlor and began to lay them with the utmost eclair. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised to see that her visitor still wore his hat and coat, standing with his back to her and staring out of the window at the falling snow in the yard. His gloved hands were clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give him a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said. Without turning, she was not sure she had heard him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis. and she noticed that he wore big, blue spectacles with sidelights, and had a bush-side whisker over his coat collar. That completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said, "as you like. In a bit the room will be warmer." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again. And Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato, and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was standing there like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eager quickness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. "Chuck, chuck, chuck," it went, the sound of a spoon being rapidly whispered around a basin. "That girl," she said. "There, I clean forgot it is her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Millie a few verbal stabs. For her excessive slowness, she had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table and done everything, while Millie, help indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and putting it with a certain stateliness upon a golden black tray, carried it into the parlor. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, her visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table, and then she noticed the overcoat and had to been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may happen to dry now," she said in a voice that broke no denial. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning she saw he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. He held a white cloth. It was a Soviet he had brought with him over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason of his muffled voice. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead, above his blue glasses, was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink peaked nose. It was bright pink and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore dark brown velvet jacket with a high black linen line, collar turned up about his neck, the thick black hair escaping as it could blow in between. The cross bandages projected in curious tails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. This muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated that for a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock they had received. She placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. "I didn't know, sir," she began that, and she stopped embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, granting from her to the door, and then at her again. "I'll have the nicely dry, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white suede head and blue goggles again as she was going out to the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of her surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered, "dare." She went quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Millie what she was messing about with now when she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glozed inquiring at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose and taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table and his meal. "The poor soul, the vaccine or operation or something," said Mrs. Hall. "What a turn them bandaged to give me, to be sure." She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and extended the traveler's coat upon this and the goggles. "Why, you look more like a diving helmet than a human man." She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, and holding that handkerchief over his mouth, all the time talking through it. Perhaps his mouth was hurt too. Maybe. She turned around as one who suddenly remembers this. "My soul alive," she said, "going off at a tangent, ain't you done them taters yet?" Millie, when Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, for he was smoking a pipe, and all the time she was in the room, he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet it was not forgetfulness, for she saw he glanced at it as it smoldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warm, through with less aggressive brevity than before. The reflection of fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles they have lacked hitherto. "I have some luggage," he said, "at Bramblehurst Station," and he asked her how he could have it sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgement of her explanation. "Tomorrow," he said, "there is no spear delivery," and seemed quite disappointed when she answered no. Was she quite sure no man with a trap who would go over? Mrs. Hall, nothing. Loaf answered his question and developed a conversation. "It's a steep road by the down, sir," she said, and answered the question about a trap, and then snatching at an opening, said it was there. "A carriage was upsettled a year ago or more. A gentleman killed besides his coachman. Accident, sir. Happen in a moment, don't they? But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily." "They do," he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. "But they take long enough to get well, don't they, do with my sister? Sanham just cut his arm with his sight. Tumbled on it in a field, and bless me, he was 3 months tied up, sir. He'd hardly believe it, it's regular, giving me a bit of a sight, sir." "I can quite understand that," said the visitor. "He was afraid one time that you'd have to have an operation. He was that bad, sir." The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. "Was he?" He said he was, sir. "And no laughing matter them as other doing for him. As I had my sister being took up with a little one, so much there was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo, so that I may make so bold to say. So will you get me some matches?" said the visitor quite abruptly. "My pipe is out." Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him. After telling him all she had done, she gasped him for a moment and remembered the 2 sovereigns. She went for the matches. "Thanks," he said concisely, as she put them down and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snapping way had irritated her, and Millie had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlor until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for an intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time. It would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing once or twice. A curious listener might have heard him at the calls, and for the space of 5 minutes he was audible. Pacing the room, he seemed to be talking to himself, and the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter to Mr. Teddy Humphrey's first impressions. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Humphrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mrs. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for them boots." The snow outside was falling faster, Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," she said. "I'd be glad if you give the old clock in the parlor a bit of a look, just going, and it strikes with an arty. But the hour I won't do nothing but point at 6. And leading away, she went across to the parlor door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing. It was seen with his bandaged head drooping on one side, the only light in the room, with the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty messages of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second, it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. And he started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with a muffler held up to his face, just as she seen him hold the Soviet before. The shadow she fancied had tricked her. "Could you mind, sir? This man are coming to look at the clock, sir," she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring round in a drowsy manner, and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake. "Certainly." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Humphrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him as Mr. Humphrey says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope so, Mr. Humphrey. There's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger. "Though I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine, for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Miss Hall, "you prefer the clock." "Certainly." To the stranger, "Certainly, but as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Hemper's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Humphrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned around, with his back to the fireplace, and put his hands behind his back, and presently he said, "When the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea." But not till the clock mending is over. Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Humphrey when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that is the earliest?" he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, "what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed, "and my baggage contains apparatus and appliances. Very useful things indeed they are, sir." "So, Mrs. Hall, and I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries. Of course, sir, my reason for coming to Ypeng," he proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner, "was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work and accident, I thought as much, said Mrs. Hall to herself, necessitate a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours. Together lock myself up sometimes now and then. Not at present, certainly at such times, the slightest disturbance. The entry of a stranger into the room is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well, these things should be understood. Certainly, sir, said Mrs. Hall, and if I might make so bold as to ask. That I think is all, said the stranger with that quietly irresistible air. Finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion after Mrs. Hall had left the room. He remained standing in front of the fire glaring, so Mr. Humphrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Humphrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, colored patches swam in his eyes, being constitutionally of a curious nature. He had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there perfectly silent and still, so still it got on Humphrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, gray and dim, was a bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fittedly, with a Mr. Green spot drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny to Henry that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henry looked down again, very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something should he remark that the weather was very cold. For the time of year, he looked up. As if you take aim without introductory shot, the weather, he began. Why didn't you finish and go? Said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. All you've got to do is to fix the R hand on his axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. 1 minute more I overlooked, and Mr. Humphrey finished and went. But he went feeling excessively annoyed. Damn it, said Mr. Humphrey to himself. Charging down the village through the thawing snow, a man must do a clock at time surely. And again, can't a man look at you ugly? And yet again, seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more wrapped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner he saw Hall, who had recently married, the stranger's hostess at the coaching horses, who now drove the Iping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Ciderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Ciderbridge, to judge by his driving. I'll do Teddy, he said, passing. He got rumming up home, said Teddy, all very socially pulled up. Was that, he asked, rum-looking customer stopping the coach notice? Said Teddy, right sakes, and he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest. Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face, if I didn't stop it in my place. Said Humphrey, that women are that trustful. Where strangers are concerned, he's took your rooms and he ain't even given a name. All you don't say so, said Hole, who is a man of sluggish apprehension. Yes, said Teddy, by the week, whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow. So he says let's hope it won't be stoned in boxes. All he told Hall how his ardent Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteaus. Altogether he left Hall vaguely suspicious. Get up, old girl, said Hall. I suppose I must see about this. Teddy charged on his way, with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he has spent into the bridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall, in spite of these discouragements. "You don't know everything," said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after Stranger gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlor and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't mastered there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations. The stranger had left when retiring for the night. He instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage. "When it came next day, you mind your own business." Hall said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at all, because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, as she was by no means assured about him. In her own mind, in the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge whiteheads, like turnips that came trailing after, at the end of interminable necks, and with vast black eyes, but being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. Chapter 3: The 1001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the Thor, the singular person fell out of infinity into Ipping village. Next day his luggage arrived through the slash, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need. But in addition there are a box of books, big fat books of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and it does no more crates. Boxes and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw. Glass bottles, the stranger muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Fear Inside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip, preparatory to help him bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Fear Inside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Hall's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Fear Inside's dog caught sight of him, however, than it began to bristle and growl savagely. And when he rushed down the steps, it gave an undecided hop, and then sprang straight at his hand. "Whoop!" cried Hall, jumping back, for he was no hero with dogs. And Fear Inside howled, "Lie down," and snatch his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of trousering, then the finer end of Fear Inside. Whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke, everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop. The latter then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted stairs to his bedroom. "You broke," you said Fear Inside, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand, while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Fear Inside. "You better hold," just stood gaping. "He was bit," said Hole. "I better go see to him," and he trotted off. The stranger, he met Mrs. Hall and the passage carrier's dog. He said, "Bitten." He went straight upstairs, and the stranger's door being ajar, he pushed it open and was entering without any ceremony. Being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind, the blind was down and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most singular thing, what seemed a handless arm waving towards him, and a face of 3 huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was struck violently in the chest, hurled back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shape, a blow and a concussion. There he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might be that he had seen. A couple of minutes after, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside, the coaching horses. There was fear inside, telling about it all over again for the second time. There was Mrs. Hall, saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. There was Huckster the general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Rogers from the Ford Judicial. Besides women and children, all of them saying fortuities wouldn't let him bite me. High nose doesn't I have such dogs? What do you buy him for then? And so forth. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he's seen anything so very remarkable happen. Upstairs, besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions. He don't want no help, he says. He said in an answer to his wife's inquiry. We better be taking his luggage in. He ought to have it cauterized at once, said Mr. Huckster, especially if it's all inflamed. I shoot him, that's what I do to the lady in the group. Suddenly the dog began to growl again. Come along, quite an angry voice in the doorway. And there stood the muffled stranger, with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down. The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased. It is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves had been changed. Would you wear it, sir? Said fear inside. I'm really sorry, the dark. Not a bit so. The stranger never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things. He then swore to himself, so Mr. Horde asserts. Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor. The stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet, and from it he began to produce bottles. Little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing colored and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labeled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottled with fine corks, bottled with bangs, bottled with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonia, on the mantel, on the table, under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many, quite a sight. It was crate after crate yielded bottles, until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates, besides the bottles, were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance, and directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and the other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner into him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottle into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she has swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table with some little emphasis, perhaps seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor, when he anticipated her. I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking, he said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. I knocked, but seemingly, perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent, unnecessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you, certainly, sir, you can turn the lock if you're like that. You know, any time. A very good idea, to the stranger. This drawer, sir, if I might make so bold to remark, don't if the straw makes trouble, put it down on the bill, and he mumbled at her words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd standing there, so aggressive and explosive. Bottle in one hand and test tube in the other. That Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed, but she was a resolute woman. In which case I should like to know, sir, what you consider a shilling. Put down a shilling, surely a shilling's enough. So be it, said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course. He turned and sat down with his coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion, and the sound of bottles ringing together, as if the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing. A thought the room, fearing something with the matter, she went to the door and listened. Not caring to knock, I can't go on, he was raving. I can't go on 300,000. For 100,000 the huge multitude cheated all my life. It may take me patience, patience indeed, ah fool. There was a noise of hobnails and of bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw a broken glass in the corner of the room, under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it, put it down in the bill, stopped her visitor. For God's sake, don't worry me. This damage done, put it down in the bill. And he went on, taking a list in the exercise book before him. I'll tell you something, said Fear inside. Mysteriously, it was late in the afternoon, and they were in the little beer shop of Ipang Hanger. Well, said Teddy Humphrey, this chap you're speaking of. What my dog Bear? Well, he's black. Leastways his legs are, I see, through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pink to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none, just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as my eye. My sakes, said Humphrey, is a Robbie case altogether. Why, his nose is pink as paint. That's true, said Fear inside. I know is that. I tell you what, I'm thinking. That marm's a pea-ball, Teddy. Black here and white there in patches, and he's ashamed of that. He's a kind of AF breed with the colors coming off. Patches of the mixing, I've heard of such things before. And it's a common way we are, says, as anyone can say. Chapter from Mr. Coos interviews the stranger. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Ipang with a certain fullness of detail, in order that the curious impression he created may be understood by the reader, but excepting to odd incidents, the circumstances of his day, until the extraordinary day of the club festival, may be passed over very cursorily. There are a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case, until late April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked to the advisability of getting rid of him, but he showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. Wait till the summer, said Mrs. Hall sagely, when the artists are beginning to come. Then we'll see. He may be a bit overbearing, but Bill settled punctual. Is Bill settled punctual, whatever you like to say. The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the egregious days. Even in costume, he worked as Mrs. Hall thought very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be continuously busy, and others he would rise late, pace his room fretting audibly for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire, communication with the world beyond the village. He had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part, his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped torn, crushed, or broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of the greatest intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him, but though Mrs. Hall listened conscientiously, she could make neither head nor tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up invisibly, whether the weather were cold or not. And he chose the loneliest paths, and those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face, under the penthouse of his hat, came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two homegoing laborers, and Teddy Humphrey, tumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shamefully by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sudden light of the opened-in door. Such children saw him at nightfall, dreamt of boogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than they disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike. On either side, it was inevitable that a person of so remarkable an appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such a village as Yipang. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained, very carefully, that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew such things as that. And would that explain that he discovered things? Her visitor had had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing there was a view largely entertained, that he was a criminal, trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up, so as to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. This idea sprang from the brain of Mr. Teddy Humphrey, no crime of any magnitude, dating from the middle or end of February, was known to have occurred, elaborated in the imagination of Mr. Gold, the probationary assistant in the National School. This theory took the form that the stranger was an anarchist, in disguise preparing explosives, and he resolved to undertake such detective operations. As his time permitted, these consisted for the most part in looking very hard at the stranger whenever they met, or in asking people who had never seen the stranger leading questions about him, but he detected nothing. Another score of opinion followed Mr. Fear inside, and either accepted the P-ball view, or some modification of it, as for instance Sidus Durgan, who was heard to assert that, if he chooses to show himself at fairs, he make his fortune in no time, and being a bit of a theologian, compared stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic. That had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups, there were waivers and compromises. Sussex folk have few superstitions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then it was only credited among the women folk. But whatever they thought of him, people in Yipang on the whole agreed in disliking him. His irritability, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker, was an amazing thing to these quiet Sussex villagers. The frantic gesticulations they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept him upon them round quiet corners, the inhuman bludgeoning of all tentative advances of curiosity, the taste for twilight that LED to the closing of doors, the pulling down of blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such goings-on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims and go pacing nervously after him. In imitation of his occult bearing, there was a song popular at that time called The Boogeyman. Miss Statue sang into the schoolroom concert, in aid of the church lamps, and thereafter whenever one or two of the villages were gathered together, and the stranger appeared, a bar or so this tune, more sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated, little children would call Boogeyman after him, and make off tremulously elated. Cass, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interest. The report of the 1,001 bottles aroused his jealous regard. All through April and May he covered it. An opportunity of talking to the stranger, and at last towards Whitsuntide, he could stand it no longer, but hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find Mr. Hall did not know his guest name. He given name said Mrs. Hall, an assertion that was quite unfounded. But I didn't rightly hear it, she thought. It seems so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible implication from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off in the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes, then a cry of surprise. A staring of feet, a chair flung aside. A bark of laughter, quick steps, the door, and Cuss appeared. His face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him, and without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps. And she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hand. She stood behind the door, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed and the place was silent again. Cass went straight up the village to Bunting. "The vicar, oh, I'm mad," Cass began abruptly. As he entered the shabby little study, "Do I look like an insane person?" "What's happened?" said the vicar, putting the ammonite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming sermon. "That chap at the inn. Well, give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told him of the interview he had just had. Went in, he gasped, and began to demand a subscription for that nurse fund. He stuck his hands in his pockets as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair, sniffed. I told him I'd heard he took an interest in scientific things. He said yes, sniffed again, kept on sniffing all the time. Evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, balance test tubes and stands, and the smell of evening primrose. Would he subscribe? Said he consider it. Asked him point blank, was he researching? Said he was a long research. Got quite cross-a-downable long research. Said he blowing the cork out, so to speak. Oh, said the first, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil, and my question boiled him over. He had been given a prescription, most valuable prescription. What for? He wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you. What are you fishing after? I apologized. Dignified sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it, 5 ingredients, put it down, turned his head. Draft of air from window, lifted the paper, swish rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace. He said saw a flicker, and there was a prescription. Burning and lifting chimney wood, rushed towards it just as it whisked up the chimney. So just at that point, to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Looked, I thought, that's a deformity, got a cork arm, I suppose, and has taken it off. So I thought there's something odd in that. What the devil keeps that sleep up and open? If there's nothing in it, there was nothing in it. I tell you nothing. Down it right down. To the joint I can see right down it to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light, shining through a tear of the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket. Quickly, I was saying, said he, that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I? Interrogative cough. How the devil, said I, can you move an empty sleeve like that? Empty sleeve, yes, I said, an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve. He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood quite close, sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch though. I'm hanged of that bandage knob of his nose. Blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone. Coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve. He said, certainly. I said it, staring and saying nothing. A bare-faced man on spectacle, start scratch, then very quietly. He pulled his sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me, as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it, seemed an age. Well, said I, clearing my throat, there's nothing in it. Had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could see right down it. He extends it straight towards me slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer thing to see, an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something exactly like a finger and thumb. It felt nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything fair, said Cuss's voice, running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to love, but I tell you I was so startled. I hit his cuff hard and turned around and cut out of the room. I left him. Cuss stopped. There was no mistake in the sincerity of his panic. He turned around in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excellent Vickers, very inferior sherry. When I hit his cuff, said Cuffs, I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm, and there wasn't an arm. There wasn't the ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunting thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's the most remarkable story. He said he looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting, with judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story. Chapter 5, The Burglary at the Vicarage. The facts of the burglary at the vicarage came to us chiefly through the medium of the vicar and his wife. It occurred in the small hours of Whit Monday, the day devoted in paying to the club festivities. Mrs. Bunting, it seems, woke up suddenly, in the stillness that comes before the dawn, with a strong impression that the door of their bedroom had opened and closed. She did not arouse her husband at first, but sat up in the bed listening. She then distinctly heard the pad of bare feet coming out of the adjoining dressing room and walking along the passage towards the staircase. As soon as she felt assured of this, she arrives Reverend Mr. Bunting. As quietly as possible, he did not strike a light, but putting on his spectacles, her dressing gown, and his bath slippers, he went out on the landing to listen. He heard quite distinctly a fumbling going on at his study desk downstairs, and then a violent sneeze. At that he returned to his bedroom, armed himself with the most obvious weapon, the poker, and descended the staircase as noisily as possible. Mrs. Bunting came out on the landing. The hour was about 4, and the ultimate darkness of the night was past. There was a faint shimmer of light in the hall, but the study doorway yawned impenetrably black. Everything was still, except the faint creaking of the stairs under Mr. Bunting's shred, and the slight movements in the study. Then something snapped. The drawer was opened, and there was a rustle of papers. Then came an implication, and a match was struck, and the study was flooded with yellow light. Mr. Bunting was now in the hall, and through the crack of the door, he could see the desk and the open drawer, and the candle burning on the desk. but the robber he could not see. He stood there in the hall undecided what to do, and Mrs. Bunting, her face white and intent, crept slowly downstairs after him. One thing kept Mr. Bunting's courage, the persuasion that this burglar was a resident in the village. They heard the chink of money and realized that the robber had found the housekeeping reserve of gold to £10 and half sovereign altogether. At that sound, Mr. Bunting was nerved to abrupt action, gripping the poker firmly. He rushed into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Bunting. Surrender tried Mr. Bunting fiercely, then stopped amazed. Apparently the room was perfectly empty. Yet their conviction that they had that very moment heard somebody moving in the room had amounted to a certainty for half a minute perhaps. They stood gaping, then Mrs. Bunting went across the room and looked behind the screen, while Mr. Bunting, by a kindred impulse, appeared under the desk. Then Mrs. Bunting turned back the window curtains, and Mr. Bunting looked up the chimney and probed it with the poker. Then Mrs. Bunting scrutinized the waste paper basket, and Mr. Bunting opened the lid of the coal scuttle. Then they came to a stop and stood with eyes interrogating each other. "I could have sworn," said Mr. Bunting. "The candle," said Mr. Bunting. "Who lit the candle?" "The drawer," said Mrs. Bunting. "And the money's gone." She went hasted just the doorway of all the strange occurrences. There was a violent sneeze in the passage. They rushed out, and as they did so, the kitchen door slammed. "Bring the candle," so Mr. Bunting, "and lead the way." They both heard a sound of bolts being hastily shot back. As he opened the kitchen door, he saw, through discovery, that the back door was just opening, and the faint light of early dawn displayed the dark masses of the garden beyond. He is certain that nothing went out of the door. It opened, stood open for a moment, and then closed with a slam. As it did so, the candle Mrs. Bunting was carrying from the study flickered and flared. It was a minute or more before they entered the kitchen. The place was empty. They refastened the back door, examined the kitchen pantry and scullery thoroughly, and at last went down into the cellar. There was not a soul to be found in the house, search as they would. Daylight found the vicar and his wife acquaint, the costumed little couple, still marveling about on their own ground floor by the unnecessary light of a guttering candle. Chapter 6. The Furniture That Went Mad. Now it happened that in the early hours of Whit Monday, before Millie was hunted out for the day, Mr. and Mrs. Hall both rose and went noiselessly down into the cellar. Their business there was of a private nature, and has something to do with the specific gravity of their beer. They had hardly entered the cellar when Mrs. Hall found she had forgotten to bring down a bottle of sarsaparilla from their joint room. As she was the expert and principal operator in this affair, Hall very properly went upstairs for it. On the landing, he was surprised to see that the stranger's door was ajar. He went on into his own room and found the bottle, as he had been directed, but returning with a bottle, he noticed that the bolt of the front door had been shot back, that the door was in fact simply on the latch, and with a flash of inspiration, he connected this with the strange room upstairs and the suggestions of Mr. Teddy Humphrey. He distinctly remembered holding the candle while Mrs. Hall shot these bolts overnight. At the sight he stopped gaping, then with the bottle still in his hand, went upstairs again. He rapped at the stranger's door. There was no answer. He rapped again, then pushed the door wide open and entered. It was as he expected. The bed, the room also was empty. And what was stranger even to his heavy intelligence, on the bedroom chair and along the rail of the bed was scattered the garments, the only garments so far as he knew, and the bandages of their guest. His big slouch hat even was cocked jointly over the bedpost. As Hall stood there, he heard his wife's voice coming out of the depth of the cellar. with that rapid telescoping of the syllables and interrogative, cocking up with the final words to a high note, by which the West Sussex villager is won, to indicate a brisk impatience. "George, you got what I want." At that he turned and hurried down to her. "Johnny," he said over the rail of the cellar steps, "test the truth what Henry says. He's not in his room, ain't the front doors on bolt head." At first Mrs. Hall did not understand, and as soon as she did, she resolved to see the empty room for herself. Hall, still holding the bottle, went first. "If he ain't there," he said, "his clothes are. And what's he doing without his clothes then? That's the most curious business." As they came up the set of steps, they both, it was afterwards ascertained, fancy they heard the front door open and shut. But seeing it closed and nothing there, neither said a word to the other about it. At the time, Mrs. Hall passed her husband in the passage and ran on first. Upstairs, someone sneezed on the staircase. Hall, following 6 steps behind, thought that he heard her sneeze, she going on first, was under the impression that Hall was sneezing. She flung open the door and stood, regarding a room of all the curious. She said she heard a sniff close behind her head, as it seemed, and turning, was surprised to see Hall 12 feet off on the topmost stair, but in another moment he was beside her. She bent forward and put her hand on the pillow, and then under the clothes, cold, she said, "He's been up this hour or more." And as she did so, her most extraordinary thing happened. The bedclothes gathered themselves together, leapt up suddenly in a sort of peak, and then jumped headlong over the bottom rail. It was exactly as if a hand had clutched them in the center and flung them aside. Immediately after, the strangers had hopped off the bedpost, described a whirling flight in the air, through the better part of a circle, and then dashed straight at Mrs. Hall's face. Then as swiftly came the sponge from the washstand, and then the chair, flinging the stranger's coat and trousers carelessly aside and laughing dryly in her voice, singularly like the stranger's, turned itself up with its forelegs. Mrs. Hall seemed to take aim at her for a moment, and charged at her. She screamed and turned, and then the chair legs came gently but firmly against her back, and impelled her and Hall out of the room. The door slammed violently and was locked. The chair and bed seemed to be executing a dance of triumph for a moment, and then abruptly everything was still. Mrs. Hall was left almost in a fainting condition, in Mr. Hall's arms on the landing. It was with the greatest difficulty that Mr. Hall and Millie, who had been roused by her scream of alarm, succeeded in getting her downstairs and applying the restoratives customary in such cases. "To spirits," said Mrs. Hall. "I know to spirits. I read in papers of them, tables and chairs leaping and dancing." "Take a drop more," Johnny said. "Hold 12 steady." "Lock him out," said Mrs. Hall. "Don't let him come in again. I have guessed I might have known with I'm guggling eyes, and banished head, and never going to church of a Sunday, and all the bottles mornings. Wait for anyone to have." He put the spirit into the furniture. "My good old furniture, it was in that very chair my poor dear mother used to sit when I was a little girl. Don't think it should rise up against me now." "Just a drop more, Johnny," said Hall. "Your nerves is all upset." They sent Millie across the street, through the golden 5 o'clock sunshine, to rouse up Mr. Sandy Rogers, the blacksmith, Mr. Hall's compliments. And the furniture upstairs was behaving most extraordinary. Would Mr. Rogers come round? He was a knowing man, was Mr. Rogers, and very resourceful. He took quite a grave view of the case. "I'm damned if that ain't witchcraft," was a view of Mr. Sandy Rogers. "You weren't all shoes for such gentry as he." He came round greatly concerned. They wanted him to lead the way upstairs the room, but he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He preferred to talk in the passage over the way. Huckster's apprentice came out and began taking down the shutters of the tobacco window. He was called over to join the discussion. Mr. Huckster naturally followed over in the course of a few minutes. The Anglo-Saxon genius for parliamentary government asserts itself. There was a great deal of talk and no decisive action. Let's have the facts first. Is it to Mrs. Andy Rogers? Let's be sure we be acting perfectly right. And busting that their door open. A door unbust is always open to busting. But you can't unbust a door once you bust it in. And suddenly, and most wonderfully, the door of the room upstairs opened of its own accord. And as they looked up in amazement, they saw descending the stairs the muffled figure of the stranger, staring more blackly and blankly than ever. With those unreasonably large blue glass eyes of his, he came down stiffly and slowly, staring all the time. He walked across the passage staring, then stopped. "Look there," he said, and their eyes followed the direction of his gloved finger and saw a bottle of sarsaparilla hard by the salador. Then he entered the parlor and suddenly, swiftly, viciously slammed the door in their faces. Not a word was spoken until the last echoes of the slam had died away. They stared at one another. "Well, if that don't lick everything," said Mr. Rogers, and left the alternative unsaid. "I go in and ask him about it," said Rogers to Mr. Hall. "I demand explanation." It took some time to bring the landlady's husband up to that pitch. At last he rapped open the door and got as far as, "Excuse me." "Go to the devil," said the stranger in a tremendous voice, "and shut that door after you." The brief interview terminated. Chapter 7. The unveiling of the stranger. The stranger went into the little parlor of the coaching horses about 5:30 in the morning, and there he remained until near midday, the blinds down, the door shut, and none after Hall's repulse venturing near him. All that time he must have fasted thrice. He rang his bell the third time, furiously and continuously, but no one answered him. "Human as go to the devil indeed," said Mrs. Hall. Presently came an imperfect rumor of the burglary at the vicarage, and two were put together. Hall, assisted by Rogers, went off to find Mr. Shackelforth, the magistrate, and take his advice. No one ventured upstairs. How the stranger occupied himself is unknown now. And then he would stride violently up and down, and twice came an outburst of curses, a tearing of paper, and a violent smashing of bottles. The little group of scared but curious people increased. Mrs. Huckster came over, some gay young fellows resplendent in black, ready-made jackets and piqué paper ties, for it was Whit Sunday, joined the group with confused interrogations. Young Archie Hawker distinguished himself by going up the yard and trying to peep under the window blinds. He could see nothing, but gave reason for supposing that he did, and others of the e-paying youth presently joined him. It was the finest of all possible Whit Mondays, and down the village street stood a row of nearly a dozen booths, a shooting gallery, and on the grass by the forge were 3 yellow and chocolate wagons, and some picturesque strangers of both sexes putting up a coconut shy. The gentlemen wore blue jerseys, the ladies white aprons, and quite fashionable hats with heavy plumes. Roger of the Purple Thorn and Mr. Jaggers, the cobbler who also sold old, second-hand ordinary bicycles, were stretching. A string of Union Jacks and Royal Ensigns, which had originally celebrated the first Victorian Jubilee across the road, and inside, in the artificial darkness of the parlor, into which only one thin jet of sunlight penetrated, the stranger, hungry, we must suppose, and fearful, hidden in his uncomfortable hot wrappings, poured through his dark glasses upon his paper, or chinked his dirty little bottles, and occasionally swore savagely at the boys. Audible, if invisible outside the windows, in the corner by the fireplace, lay the fragment of 6 smashed bottles, and a pungent twang of chlorine tainted the air. So much we know from what was heard at the time, and from what was subsequently seen in the room. About noon, he suddenly opened his parlor door and stood, glaring fixedly at the 3 or 4 people in the bar. "Mrs. Hall," he said. Somebody went sheepishly and called for Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared after an interval, a little short of breath, but all the fears for that all was still out. She had deliberated over the scene, and she came, holding a little tray with an unsettled bill upon it. "Is it your bill you wanting, sir?" she said. "Why wasn't my breakfast laid? Why haven't you prepared my meals? And ask my bell, do you think I live without eating? Why isn't my bill paid?" said Mrs. Hall. "That's what I want to know. I told you 3 days ago I was awaiting a remittance. I told you 2 days ago I wasn't going to wait. No remittances. You can't rumble if your breakfast wait a bit. If my bill's been waiting these 5 days, can ya?" The stranger saw briefly but vividly. No, from the bar, and I thank you kindly, sir." "If you keep your swearing to yourself, sir," said Mrs. Hall. The stranger stood, looking more like an angry diving helmet than ever. It was universally felt in the bar that Mrs. Hall had the better of him. His next words showed as much. "Look here, my good woman," he began. "Don't good woman me," said Mrs. Hall. "I've told you my remittance hasn't come." "Remittance indeed," say Mrs. Hall. "Still I dare say. In my pocket. You told me 3 days ago that you hadn't anything but a sovereign's worth of silver upon you. Well, I found some more. Hello from the bar. I wonder where you found it." The Mrs. Hall. That seemed to annoy the stranger very much. He stamped his foot. "What do you mean?" he said that. "I wonder where you found it. So Mrs. Hall, and before I take any bills or get any breakfast, or do any such thing whatsoever, you got to tell me 1 or 2 things I don't understand, and what nobody don't understand, and what everybody is very anxious to understand. I want to know what you've been doing to my chair upstairs, and I want to know how just your room was empty, and how you got in again. Demo stops in this house, comes in by the doors. That's the rule of the house, and that you didn't do. And what I want to know is how you did come in, and what I want to know." Suddenly the stranger raised his gloved hands clenched, stamped his foot and said, "Stop," with such extraordinary violence that he silenced her instantly. "You don't understand," he said. "Who I am or what I am, I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Yeah," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was a stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. Then he removed his spectacles, and everyone in the bar gasped. He took off his hat and, with a violent gesture, toward his whiskers and bandages. For a moment they resisted him. A flash of horrible anticipation passed through the bar. "Oh my God," says someone, then off they came. It was worse than anything. Mrs. Hall, standing open-mouthed and horror-struck, shrieked at what she saw and made for the door of the house. Everyone began to move. They were prepared for scars, disfigurements, tangible horrors, but nothing. The bandages and false hair flew across the passage into the bar, making a hobbled dahoy jump to avoid them. Everyone tumbled on everyone else down the steps. For the man who stood there, shouting some incoherent explanation, was a solid, gesticulating figure up to the coat collar of him, and then nothingness, no visible thing at all. People down the village heard shouts and streaks, and looking up the street, saw the coach and horses violently firing out its humanity. They saw Mrs. Hall fall down, and Mr. Teddy Humphrey jump to avoid tumbling over. And then they heard the frightful screams of Millie, who, emerging suddenly from the kitchen at the noise. The tumult have come upon the headless stranger. From behind these increased suddenly. Forthwith everyone all down the street, the sweet stuff seller, coconut shy proprietor and his assistant, the swingmen, little boys and girls, Rustic dandies, smart wenches, smoked elders, and aproned gypsies began running towards the inn, and in a miraculously short space of time, a crowd of perhaps 40 people, and rapidly increasing, swayed and hooted, and inquired and exclaimed and suggested. In front of Mrs. Hall's establishment, everyone seemed eager to talk at once, and the result was Babel. A small group supported Mrs. Hall was picked up in a state of collapse. There was a conference, and the incredible evidence of a vociferous eyewitness. "Oh, bogey, what's he been doing then? He not the girl, is he? Run at him with a knife, I believe. No head, I tell you. I don't mean no manner of speaking. I mean man without head. Nonsense to some conjuring trick. They stop his rapping. He did, and it struggles to see in through the open door." The crowd formed itself into a struggling wedge, with a more adventurous apex nearest the inn. Easter, for a moment I heard the girl screaming. He turned, I saw her skirts whisk, and he went after her. Didn't take 10 seconds, Becky. Comes the knife in his hand and the loaf. So just as if he was staring not a moment ago. Went in at their door. We tell he ain't got no head at all. You just missed him. There was a disturbance behind, and the speaker stopped to step aside for a little procession that was marching very resolutely towards the house. First Mr. Hall, very red and determined. Then Mr. Bobby Jaffers, the village constable. Then the weary M.R. Rogers. They had come now armed with a warrant. People shouted conflicting information of the recent circumstances. "Ed or no Ed," said Daffers, "I got arrested and arrested my will." Mr. Hall marched up the steps, marched straight the door of the parlor, and flung it open. "Constable," he said, "do you do eat?" Jaffers marched in all. Next ward is last they saw in the dim light. The headless figure facing them with a nod across, the bread in one gloved hand, and a chunk of cheese in the other. "That's him," said Hall. "What the devils?" This came in a tone of angry expostulation from above, the color of the figure. "You're a damn wrong customer, Mr. to Mr. Jeffers. But Ed or no Ed, the warrant says body, and duty's duty." "Keep off," said the figure, starting back abruptly. He whipped down the bread and cheese, and Mr. Hall just grasped the knife on the table, in time to save it. Off came the stranger's left glove, and was slapped in Jaffa's face. In another moment Jaffa's cutting short. Some statement concerning a warrant had gripped him by the hand, this wrist, and caught his invisible throat. He got a sound kicking on the shin that made him shout, but he kept his grip. Hall sent a knife sliding along the table to Rogers, who acts as goalkeeper for the offensive, so to speak, and then stepped forward as Jaffers. And the stranger swayed and staggered towards him, clutching and hitting in a chair, stood in the way, and went aside with a crash as they came down together. "Get the feet," the Jaffers between his teeth. Mr. Hall, endeavoring to acting instructions, received a sounding kick in the ribs that disposed of him for a moment, and Mr. Rogers, seen a decapitated stranger, had rolled over and got the upper side of Jaffers, retreated toward the door, knife in hand, and so collided with Mr. Huckster and Mr. Dobbridge, Carter coming to the rescue of law and order. At the same moment, down came 3 or 4 bottles from the chiffonier, and shot a web of pungenta in the air of the room. "I surrender," cried the stranger, though he had Jaffers down, and in another moment he stopped panting, a strange figure, headless and handless, for he had pulled off his right glove now, as well as his left. "It's no good," he said, as if sobbing for breath. It was the strangest thing in the world, to hear that voice coming as if out of empty space. But the Sussex peasants are perhaps the most matter-of-fact people under the sun. Jaffers got up also and produced a pair of handcuffs. Then he stared. "I say," said Jaffers, brought up short by dim realization of the integrity of the whole business. "Darn it, can't use them as I can see." The stranger ran his arm down his waistcoat, and as if by a miracle, the buttons to which his empty sleeve pointed became undone. Then he said something about his shin and stooped down. He seemed to be fumbling with his shoes and socks. "Why," said Huckster suddenly. "That's not a man at all, it's just empty clothes. Look, you can see down his collar and the linings of his clothes." I could put my arm. He extended his hand. It seemed to meet something in midair, and he drew it back with a sharp exclamation. "I wish you'd keep your fingers out of my eye," said the aerial voice in a tone of savage expostulation. "The fact is I'm all here, head, hands, legs, and all the rest of it. But it happens I'm invisible. It's a confounded nuisance, but that's no reason why. I should be poked to pieces by every stupid bumpkin, and e-paying is it?" The suit of clothes, now all unbuttoned, and hanging loosely upon its unseen supports, stood up arms akimbo. Several other the main folks had now entered the room, so that was closely crowded. "Invisible," said Huckster, ignoring the strangers. "Abuse whoever had the likes of that. It's strange perhaps, but it's not a crime. Why am I assaulted by a policeman in this fashion?" "Ah, that's a different matter," said Jaffers. "No doubt you are a bit difficult to see in this light. But I got a warrant, and it's all correct. And what I'm after ain't no invisibility. It's burglary. There's a house being broken to. And money took. Well, and circumstances certainly point stubborn nonsense," said the invisible man. "I hope so, sir. But I got my instructions well," said the stranger. I'll come, but no handcuffs." "It's the regular thing," said Jaffers. "No handcuffs," stipulated the stranger. "Pardon me," said Jaffers. Abruptly, the figure sat down. And before anyone could realize what was being done, the slippers, socks, and trousers have been kicked off under the table. Then he sprang up again and flung off his coat. "You stop that," said Jaffers, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped at the waistcoat. It struggled, and the shirt slipped out of it, and left it limp and empty in his hand. "Hold him," so Jaffers loudly. "Once he gets the things off, hold him," cried everyone. And there was a rush at the fluttering white shirt, which was now all that was visible of the stranger. The shirt sleeve plants to shrew blow in Hall's face. That stopped his open arm advance and sent him backward into Old Tooth and the sexton. And in another moment the garment was lifted up and became convulsed and vacantly flapping about the arms, even as a shirt that is being thrust over a man's head. Jaffers clutched it and only helped pull it off. He was struck in the mouth out of the air, and incontinently, through his tension and smoked Teddy Humphrey savagely upon the crown of his head. "Look out," said everybody, fencing at random and hitting nothing. "Oh damn, shut the door, don't let him loose. I got something here, he is." A perfect babel of noises they made. Everybody, it seemed, was being hit all at once, and Sandy Rogers knowing as ever, and his wits sharpened by a frightful blow in the nose, reopened the door and let the root, the others following incontinently, were jammed for a moment to the corner by the doorway. The hitting continued. Phipps, the Unitarian, had a front tooth broken, and Humphrey was injured the cartilage of his ear. Jaffers was struck under the jaw and turning, caught something that intervened between him and Huxton the melee and prevented they coming together. He felt a muscular chest, and in another moment, the whole mass of struggling, excited men shot out into the crowded hall. I got him shattered. Jaffers choking and reading through them all, and wrestling with purple face and swelling veins against his unseen enemy. Men staggered right and left as extraordinary conflict swayed swiftly towards the house door and went spinning down the half-dozen steps of the inn. Jaffers cried in a strangled voice, holding tight nevertheless, and making play with his knee, spun around and fell heavily undermost with his head on the gravel. Only then did his fingers relax. There were excited cries of "Old him," "Invisible," and so forth, and a young fellow, a stranger in the place, whose name did not come to light, rushed in at once, caught something, missed his hold, and fell over the comfortable prostrate body halfway across the road. A woman screamed as something pushed by her. A dog kicked, apparently yelped, and ran howling into Hoxter's yard. And with that, the trance to the invisible man was accomplished. For a space, people stood amazed and gesticulating. And then came panic, as scattered them abroad through the village, as a gust scatters dead leaves, but Jaffas lay quite still, face upward and knees bent, at the foot of the steps of the inn. Chapter 8 in Transit. The 8th chapter is exceedingly brief, and relates that Gibbons, the amateur naturalist of the district, while lying out in the spacious, open downs, without a soul within a couple of miles of him, as he thought and almost dozing, heard close to him the sound of a man coughing, sneezing, and then swearing savagely to himself, and looking beheld nothing. Yet the voice was indisputable. It continued to swear without breath of variety that distinguishes the swearing of a cultivated man. It grew to a climax, diminished again, and died, away in the distance going. As it seemed to him in the direction of Audine, it lifted to a spasmodic sneeze and ended. Gibbons had heard nothing of the morning's occurrences, but the phenomenon was so striking and disturbing, but his philosophical tranquility vanished. He got up hastily and hurried down the steepness of the hill, towards a village as fast as he could go. Chapter 9. Mr. Thomas Marvel. You must picture Mr. Thomas Marvel as a person of copious flexible visage, a nose of cylindrical protrusion, a liquorish ample of fluctuated mouth, and a beard of bristling eccentricity, his figure inclined to ombre noir. His short limbs accentuated this incarnation. He wore a furry silk hat, and the frequent substitution of twine and shoelaces for buttons, apparent at critical points of his costume, marked a man essentially bachelor. Mr. Thomas Marvel was sitting with his feet in a ditch, by the roadside down toward Aberdeen, about 1.5 miles out of Ypeng. His feet, safer socks of irregular open work, were bare. His big toes were broad and pricked like the ears of a watchful dog. In a leisurely manner, he did everything in a leisurely manner. He was contemplating trying on a pair of boots. They were the soundest boots he'd come across for a long time, but were too large for him, whereas the ones he had were in dry weather, a very comfortable fit but too thin. Sold for damp. Mr. Thomas Marvel hated roomy shoes, but then he hated damp. He had never properly thought out which he hated most, and it was a pleasant day, and there was nothing better to do. So he put the fresh shoes in a graceful group on the turf and looked at them, and seeing them there, among the grass and springy agamani, it suddenly occurred to him that both pairs were exceedingly ugly to see. He was not at all startled by a voice behind him. "They're boots anyhow," said the voice. "They are charity boots," said Mr. Thomas Marvel, with his head on one side, regarding them distastefully. "And which is the ugliest pair in the whole blessed universe?" "I'm darned if I know," said the voice. "I've worn worse. In fact, I've worn none, but none so audacious ugly, if you allow the expression. I've been catching boots in particular for days, because I was sick of them. They sound enough, of course, but a gentleman on tramps, he's such a thundering lot of his boots. And if you'll believe me, I've raised nothing in the whole blessed country. Try as I would but them. Look at them in a good country for boots too. In a general way, it's just my promiscuous look. I've got my boots in this country 10 years or more. And then they treat you like this. It's a beast of a country. To the voice and pigs for people, ain't it so?" Mr. Thomas Marvel lowered, but then boots it beats it. He turned his head over his shoulder to the right, to look at the boots of his interlocutor, with a view to comparisons, and lo, where the boots of his interlocutor should have been, when neither legs nor boots, he was irradiated by the dawn of a great amazement. "Where are you?" said Mr. Thomas Marvel. Over his shoulder, coming on all fours, he saw a stretch of empty downs, with the wind swaying the remote green. Pointed furze bush. Am I drunk? Said Mr. Marvel. I had visions to talking to myself. What the don't be alarmed to the voice, none of your ventriloquizing me, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rising sharply to his feet. Where are you alarmed indeed? Don't be alarmed, repeated the voice. You'll be alarmed in a minute, you silly fool, so Mr. Thomas Marvel. Where are you? Let me get my mark on you. Are you buried? Said Mr. Thomas Marvel. After an interval, there was no answer. Mr. Thomas Marvel stood bootless and amazed. His jacket nearly thrown off peewit to the peewit. Very remote, he would indeed, said Mr. Thomas Marvel. This ain't no time for foolery. The down was desolate east and west, north and south. The road, with its shallow ditches and white bordering stakes, ran smooth and empty north and south, and save for the peewit the blue sky was empty too. So help me, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, shuffling his coat onto his shoulders again. It's a drink I might unknown. It's not the drink, said the voice. You keep your nerves steady, oh, said Mr. Marvel. His face blew white and missed its patches. It's the drink, his lips repeated noiselessly. He remained staring about him, rotating slowly backwards. I could have swore I heard a voice, he whispered. Of course you did. Is there again so, Mr. Marvel? Closing his eyes and clasping his hand on his brow, with a tragic gesture, he was suddenly taken by the collar and shaken violently and left more dazed than ever. Don't be a fool, said the voice. I'm off my blooming champ, said Mr. Marvel. Is no good, it's frightened about them blasty boots. I'm off my blessed blooming champ. Oyster spirits, neither one thing nor the other. Set the voice, listen. Jump, said Mr. Marvel. 1 minute, said the voice penetratingly. Tremulous with self-control. Well, said Mr. Marvel, with a strange feeling of having been dug in the chest. By a finger, you think I'm just imagination. Just imagination. What else can you be, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, rubbing the back of his neck. Very well, said the voice in a tone of relief. And I'm going to throw flint at you, till you think differently. But where are you? The voice made no answer. Came a flint, apparently out of the air, and missed Mr. Marvel's shoulder by hair's breadth. Mr. Marvel, turning, saw a flint jerk up into the air, trace a complicated path, hang for a moment, and then fling at his feet with almost invisible rapidity. He was too amazed to dodge. Wizard came and ricocheted from a bare toe into the ditch. Mr. Thomas Marvel jumped a foot and howled aloud. Then he starts to run, tripped over an unseen obstacle, and came head over heels into a sitting position. Now, said the voice, as a third stone curved upward and hung in the air above the tramp. Am I imagination? Mr. Marvel, by way of reply, struggled to his feet and was immediately rolled over again. He lay quiet for a moment. If you struggle any more, said the voice, I shall throw the flint at your head. It's a fair do, said Mr. Thomas Marvel, sitting up, taking his wounded toe in his hand and fixing his eye on the third missile. I don't understand it. Stones flinging themselves. Stones talking. Put yourself down. Rot away, I'm done. The third flint fell. It's very simple, that the voice. I'm an invisible man. Tell us something I don't know. So Mr. Marvel, gasping with pain. Where you've hid, how'd he do it? I don't know, I'm beat at all, to the voice. I'm invisible, that's what I want you to understand. Anyone could see that. There's no need for you to be so confounded. Impatient, mister. Now then, give us a notion. How are you hid? I'm invisible, that's the great point. And what I want you to understand is this. But whereabouts? Interrupted Mr. Marvel. Here's 6 yards in front of you. Oh, come. I ain't blind, you'll be telling me next. You're just thin air. I'm not one of your ignorant tramps. Yes, I am thin air. You're looking through me. What I know, new stuff to you, Vox A. What is it, Jabba? Is it that I am just a human being, solid, needing food and drink, needing covering too? But I'm invisible, you see, invisible. Simple idea, invisible. Wow, real like. Yes, real. Let's have a hand of you, said Marvel, if you are real. "It won't be so darn out the way like then, Lord," he said. "How you made me jump gripping me like that." He felt the hand that he closed around his wrist with his disengaged fingers, and his fingers went timorously up the arm, patted a muscular chest, and explored a bearded face. Marvel's face was astonishment. "Undashed," he said, "is this don't beat cock fighting post remarkable. And there I can see a rabbit cling through you. Half a mile away not a bit of you is visible set." He scrutinized the apparently empty space keenly. "You ain't been eating bread and cheese?" he asked, holding the invisible arm. "You're quite right. And it's not quite assimilated into the system," said Mr. Marvel. "So ghostly though. Of course all this isn't half so wonderful as you think. It's quite wonderful enough for my modest wants. To Thomas Marvel, how'd you manage it? And it deuces it done. It's too long a story, and besides, I tell you the old business fairly beats me," said Mr. Marvel. "What I want to say at present is this. I need help, I've come to that. I came upon you suddenly, I was wondering, mad with rage, naked, impotent, I could have murdered, and I saw you." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "I came up behind you, hesitated." Went on. Mr. Marvel's expression was eloquent and stopped. "Here," I said, "is an outcast like myself. This is the man for me, so I turned back and came to you." "You and Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "I'm holding a tizzy. May I ask how is it? And what you may be requiring in the way of help? Invisible, I want you to help me get clothes and shelter. And then with other things, I've left them long enough. If you won't, well, but you will must. Look, here is it." Mr. Marvel, I'm flabbergasted. "Don't knock me about anymore and leave me go. I must get steady a bit, and you pretty near broken my toe. It's also unreasonable, empty downs, empty sky, nothing visible for miles. Is it the bosom of nature?" And then comes a voice out of heaven and stoned, and a fist. "Lord, pull yourself together," said the voice. "For you have to do the job I've chosen. For you." Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were round. "I've chosen you," to the voice. "You are the only man. Except some of those fools down there, who knows there is such a thing as an invisible man. You have to be my helper. Help me, and I would do great things for you. An invisible man is a man of power." He stopped for a moment to sneeze violently. "But if you portray me," he said, "if you fail to do as I direct you." He paused and tapped Mr. Marvel's shoulders smartly. Mr. Marvel gave a yelp of terror at the touch. "I don't want to betray you. So, Mr. Marvel," edging away from the direction of the fingers, "don't you go with thinking that whatever you do, all I want to do is help you. Just tell me what I got to do, Lord. Whatever you want done, that I'm most willing to do." Chapter 10. Mr. Marvel's visit to Yiping. After the first gusty panic has spent itself, Yiping became argumentative. Skepticism suddenly reared its head. Rather nervous skepticism, not at all assured of its back. But skepticism nevertheless. It is so much easier not to believe in an invisible man. And those who had actually seen him dissolve into air, or felt the strength of his arm, could be counted on the fingers of two hands. And all these witnesses Mr. Rogers was presently missing, having retired impregnably behind the bolts and bars of his own house, and Jaffers was lying, stunned in the parlor of the coaching horses. Great and strange ideas transcending experience often have less effect upon men and women than smaller, more tangible considerations. Yiping was gay with bunting, and everybody was in guarded dress. Wit Monday had been looked forward to for a month or more. By the afternoon, even those who believed in the unseen were beginning to resume their little amusements, in a tentative fashion, on the supposition that he had quite gone away. And with the skeptics he was already a jest. But people, skeptics and believes alike, were remarkably sociable all that day. Hazeman's Meadow was gay with a tent in which Mrs. Bunty and other ladies were preparing tea, while without the Sunday school children ran races and played games, under the noisy guidance of the curate and the Mrs. Cuss and Sack. But no doubt, there was a slight uneasiness in the air, but people for the most part had the sense to conceal whatever imaginative qualms they experienced. On the village green an incline, strong rope, down which clinging the wild to a pulley swung handle, one could be held violently against a sack at the other end, came in for considerable favor among the adolescents, as also did the swings and the coconut shires. There was also promenading, and the steam organ attached to a small roundabout filled the air with a pungent flavor of oil, and with equally pungent music. Members of the club, who had attended church in the morning, were splendid in badges of pink and green, and some of the gear-minded. It also adorned their bowler hats with brilliant, colored favors of ribbon. Old Fletcher, whose conceptions of holiday-making were severe, was visible through the jasmine about his window, or through the open door, whichever way you chose to look, poised delicately on a plank, supported on 2 chairs, and whitewashing the ceiling of his front room. About 4 o'clock a stranger entered the village. From the direction of the downs, he was a short, stout person in an extraordinarily shabby top hat, and he appeared to be very much out of breath. His cheeks were alternately limp and tightly puffed. His mottled face was apprehensive, and he moved with a sort of reluctant alacrity. He turned the corner of the church and directed his way to the coach and horses. Among others, old Fletcher remember seeing him, and indeed the old gentleman was so struck by his peculiar agitation that he inadvertently allowed a quantity of whitewash to run down the brush into the sleeve of his coat while regarding him. This stranger, to the perceptions of the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, appeared to be talking to himself, and Mr. Huckster remarked the same thing. He stopped the foot of the coach and horse's steps, and according to Mr. Huckster, appeared to undergo a severe internal struggle before he could induce himself to enter the house. Finally, he marched up the steps and was seen by Mr. Huckster to turn to the left and open the door of the parlor. Mr. Huckster heard voices from within the room, and from the bar apprising the man of his error. That room's private said hall, and the stranger shut the door clumsily and went into the bar. In the course of a few minutes, he reappeared wiping his lips with the back of his hand with an air of quite satisfaction. That somehow impressed Mr. Huckster, as assumed. He stood looking about him for some moments, and then Mr. Huckster saw him walk, in an oddly flirted manner, towards the gate of the yard, upon which the parlor window opened. The stranger, after some hesitation, leant against one of the gate posts, produced a sort of clay pipe, and prepared to fill it. His fingers trembled while doing so. He lit it clumsily, and folding his arms, began to smoke in a languid attitude, an attitude which his occasional glances up the yard altogether bullied. All this Mr. Huckster saw over the canisters of the tobacco window, and the singularity of the man's behavior prompted him to maintain his observation. Presently, the stranger stood up abruptly and put his pipe in his pocket. Then he vanished into the yard. Forthwith Mr. Huckster, conceiving he was witness of some petty larceny, leapt around his counter and ran out into the road to intercept the thief. As he did so, Mr. Marvel reappeared, his hat askew, a big bundle in a blue tablecloth in one hand, and 3 books tied together, as it proved afterwards, with the vicar's braces in the other. Directly he saw Huckster, he gave a sort of gasp and turning sharply to the left, began to run. "Stop thief!" cried Huckster, and set off after him. Mr. Huckster's sensations were vivid but brief. He saw the man just before him, and spurting briskly for the church corner and the hill road. He saw the village flags and festivities beyond, and a face or so turned towards him. He bawled, "Stop!" again. He'd hardly gone 10 strides before his shin was caught in some mysterious fashion, and he was no longer running, but flying with inconceivable rapidity through the air. He saw the ground suddenly close to his face. The world seemed to splash into a million whirling specks of light, and subsequent proceedings interested him no more. Chapter 11 in the Coach and Horses. Now, in order to clearly understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huckster's window. At that precise moment, Mr. Cass and Mr. Bunting were in the parlor. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the invisible man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall and had gone home in the charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Mrs. Hall and the room tidied up, and on the table under the window where the stranger be wont to work, Cass had hit almost at once on 3 big books in manuscript labeled Diary. Diary, said Cass, putting the 3 books on the table now. At any rate, we shall learn something. The vicar stood with his hands the table. Diary, repeated Cass, sitting down, putting 2 volumes to support the 3rd and opening it. No name on the flyleaf, bother, cipher and figures. The vicar came round to look over his shoulder. Cass turned the pages over with a face suddenly disappointed. Timmy, it's all cipher, Bunting. There are no diagrams, asked Mr. Bunting. No illustrations throwing light. See for yourself to Mysticus. Some of it's mathematical and some of it's Russian, or some language to judge by the letters. And some of it's Greek. Now the Greek, I thought you. Of course, said Mr. Bunting, taking out and wiping his spectacles, and feeling suddenly very uncomfortable. Or he had no Greek left in his mind worth talking about. Yes, the Greek, of course, may furnish a clue. I'll find your place. I'd rather glance to the volumes first, said Mr. Bunting, still wiping. A general impression first, Cass, and then, you know, we can go looking for clues. He coughed, put on his glasses, arranged them fastidiously, coughed again, and wished something would happen to avert the seemingly inevitable exposure. Then he took the volume Cass handed him in a leisurely manner. And then something did happen. The door opened suddenly. Both gentlemen started violently, looked around, and were relieved to see a sporadically rosy face beneath a furry silk cat. Tap asked the face and stood staring. No, said both gentlemen at once. Over the other side, my man, said Mr. Bunting. And please shut back door, said Mysticus irritably. All right, to the intruder, as it seemed in a low voice, curiously different from the huskiness of its first inquiry. What you are to the intruder in the former voice. Stand clear, and he vanished and closed the door. A sailor, I should judge, see Mr. Bunting. Amusing fellows they are. Stand clear, indeed a nautical term, referring to his getting back out of the room. I suppose I dare say so, said Class. My nerves are all loose today. It quite maybe jumped the door opening like that. Mr. Bunting smiled as if he had not jumped, and now he said with a sigh, these books. Someone sniffed as he did so. One thing is indisputable, said Bunting, drawing up a chair next to that of Cass. There certainly have been very strange things happen in E-paying during the last few days. Very strange. I cannot, of course, believe in this absurd invisibility story. Is incredible, said Cass. Incredible, but the fact remain that I certainly saw right down his sleeve. But did you? Are you sure? Suppose a mirror, for instance. Hallucinations are so easily produced. I don't know if you've ever seen a really good Chandra. I won't argue again, said Cass. We thrashed that out, Bunting, and just now there's these books. Here's some of what I take to be Greek. Greek letters, certainly. He pointed to the middle of the page. Mr. Bunting flushed slightly and brought his face nearer, apparently finding some difficulty with his glasses. Suddenly he became aware of a strange feeling At the nape of his neck he tried to raise his head and encountered an immovable resistance. The feeling was a curious pressure, the grip of a heavy, firm hand, and it bore his chin irresistibly to the table. "Don't move, little man," whispered the voice, "or I'll brain you both." He looked into the face of Cuss, close to his own, and saw a horrified reflection of his own. Sickly astonishment. "I'm sorry to handle you so roughly," said the voice, "but is unavoidable. Since when did you learn to pry into an investigator's private memoranda?" said the voice, and two chins struck the table simultaneously, and two sets of teeth rattled. "Since when did you learn to invade the private rooms of a man in misfortune?" And the concussion was repeated. "Where have they put my clothes?" Listen to the voice. "The windows are fastened, and I've taken the key out of the door. I'm a very strong man, and I have the poker handy. Besides being invisible, there's not the slightest doubt that I could kill you both and get away quite easily. If I wanted to, do you understand very well? If I let you go, will you promise not to try any nonsense and do what I tell you?" The vicar and the doctor looked at one another, and the doctor pulled a face. "Yes," said Mr. Bunting, and the doctor repeated it. And the pressure on the next relaxed, and the doctor and the vicar sat up, both very red in the face and wriggling their heads. "Please keep sitting where you are. To the invisible man is the poker. You see, when I came into this room," continued the invisible man, after presenting the poker to the tip of the nose of each of his visitors, "I did not expect to find it occupied, and I expected to find, in addition to my books of memoranda, an outfit of clothing. Where is it? No. Don't rise, I can see it's gone now. Just at present that the days are quite warm enough for an invisible man to run about stark. The evenings are quite chilly. I want clothing and other accommodation, and I must also have those 3 books." Chapter 12. The invisible man loses his temper. It is unavoidable that at this point, the narrative should break off again, for certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. While these things were going on in the parlor, and while Mr. Huckster was watching Mr. Marvel, smoking his pipe against the gate, not a dozen yards away, were Mr. Hall and Teddy Humphrey discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one e-paying topic. Suddenly they came. A violent thud against the door of the parlor, a sharp cry, and then silence. "Hello, City Humphrey. Hello," from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly but surely. "That ain't right," he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the Padre door. He and Teddy approached the door together. With intent faces, their eyes considered somewhat wrong. Ted Hall and Humphrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odor met them, and there was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. "Yeah, right there. Asshole rapping the magic." Conversation ceased abruptly for a moment's silence. Then the conversation was resumed in hissing whispers. Then a sharp cry of "No, no, you don't." Then came a sudden motion, and the oversetting of a chair. A brief struggle. Silence again. "All the doss," exclaimed Humphrey Sadavosh. "You all right there?" asked Mr. Hall sharply again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious, jerking intonation. "Quite right. Please don't interrupt." "Odd," said Humphrey. "Odd," said Mr. Hall. "Says, don't interrupt," said Humphrey. "Or Erden," said Hall, and a sniff, said Humphrey. They remained listening. The conversation was rapid and subdued. "I can't say," Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?" "Ah, temporary, says he will not," said Hall. "Won't speak to us, was he?" Disgraceful to Mr. Bunting within. Disgraceful to Mr. Humphrey. "I heard it distinct." "Who's that speaking now?" "Artemfrey. Mr. Coss, I suppose," said Hall. "Can you hear anything?" Silence. The sounds within indistinct and perplexing. "Sounds like throwing the tablecloth about," said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. All made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wifely opposition. "What you listin' there for all she had? Ain't you nothing better to do? Busy day like this." All try to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show. But Mrs. Hall was object. She raised her voice so Hall and Humphrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything, what they heard at all then. She insisted on Hall keeping silence, while Humphrey told her his story. She was inclined to think the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about. "Or you didn't say disgraceful that, or he did," said Hall. "I hear that. This is all," said Humphrey. Like as not, began Mrs. Hall. "So Mr. Teddy Humphrey did not hear the window." "What window?" said Mrs. Hall. "Parlor window," said Humphrey. Everyone stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the indoor, the road white and vivid, and Huckster's shop front, blistering in the June sun. Abruptly Huckster's door opened and Huckster appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. "Yeah, right, Huckster. Stop thief," and he ran obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gates and vanished. Simultaneously came a tumor from the parlor, and the sound of windows being closed. Paul Humphrey and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once, pell-mell into the street. They saw someone whisk around the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huckster executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder down the street. People were standing astonished or running towards them. Mr. Huckster was stunned. Henry stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two laborers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appear to have jumped the impossible conclusion that this was the Invisible Man, suddenly become visible, and set off at once along a lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a shout of the astonishment and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the laborers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged, just as one charges a man at football. The second laborer came round in a circle, stared, and, conceiving that Hall had tumbled over, of his own accord turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tricked by the ankle just as Huckster had been. Then as the first neighbor struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox as he went down. The rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut, a burly man in the blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty, save for three men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways, just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner following headlong. The two were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of over-hasty people. Now when Hall and Humphrey and the laborers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next to the till, and suddenly the parlor door was open and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glance at her, rushed once down the steps towards the corner. "Hold him," he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel." He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the Invisible Man at hand, over books and bundle in the yard. The face of Emarchus was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed master in grease. "Hold him," he bawled. "He's got my trouser and every stitch of the vicar's clothes. Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Humphrey as he passed a prostrate Huckster, and coming around the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet into an indecorous brawl. Somebody in full flight tried heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was involved not in a capture, but a rout. Everyone was running back to the village. He rose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the coach. And horses forthwith leaping over the deserted huckster, who was now sitting up on his way. Behind him, as he was halfway up the insteps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out the confusion of cries and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognized the voice as that of the invisible man, and the note was that of the man, suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment, Mr. Castle's back in the parlor. "He's coming back, Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself." Mr. Bundy was standing in the window, engaging in attempted clothe himself in the hearthrug. "And a West Surrey Gazette who's coming," he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. Invisible man said cuss and rushed onto the window. "We better clear out from here. He's fighting Mad." Mad. In another moment he was out in the yard. "Good heavens," said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between two horrible alternatives. He had a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fed up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the invisible man screamed with rage, and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the invisible man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books, but his temper at no time very good seems to gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing. For the mere satisfaction of hurting, you must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming and fights for hiding places. You must figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and two chairs. With cataclysmic results, you must figure an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing, and then the whole tumultuous rushed is past. The paying street with its gourds and flags is deserted, save the still raging unseen and littered with coconuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stocking trade of a sweet stuff store. Everywhere there's a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The invisible man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the coaching horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlor window of Mrs. Gribble. Key, it must have been, who cut the telegraph wire to Adine, just beyond Higgins' cottage on the Adine Road, and after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt an paying anymore. He vanished absolutely, but it was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of Iping Street. Chapter 13. Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation when the dusk was gathering, and Ian was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the shattered wreckage of its bank holiday. A short, thick set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beechwoods on the road to Bramblehurst. He carried 3 books, bound together by some sort of ornamental, elastic ligature, and a bundle wrapped in a blue tablecloth. His Rubicon face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in a spasmodic sort of hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen hands. "If you give me the slip again," said the voice, "if you attempt to give me the slip again." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "that shows a massive bruises, as it is on my honor." Said the voice, "I will kill you." "I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel, in a voice that was not far remote from tears. "I swear I didn't know the blessed attorney." That was all how the devil was I supposed to know. The blessed attorney as it is, I've been knocked about. You'll get knocked about a root deal more. If you don't mind the voice, Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. It's bad enough to let these floundering yokels explode. My little secret, without your cutting off with my books. It's like if some of them, they cut and ran when they did. Here am I, no one knew I was invisible, and now what am I to do? What am I to do, said Marvel, sort of Archie. It's all about it will be in the papers. Everybody will be looking for me, everyone on their guard. The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased. The despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened, and his pace slackened. Go on for the voice. Mr. Marvel's face assumed a grayish tint. Between the ruddier patches, don't drop those books, stupid. That the voice sharply overtaking him. The fact is, said the voice, I shall have to make use of you. You're a poor tool, but I must. I'm a miserable tool, said Marvel. You are, said the voice. I'm the worst possible tool. You could have said Marvel. I'm not strong, he said. After discouraging silence, I'm not over strong, he repeated. No, and my heart's weak. That little business, I pulled it through a cause. But bless you, haha, could have dropped. Well, I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing. You want, I'll stimulate you all. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans. You know, but I might have sheer funk and misery. You better not, to the voice with quiet emphasis. I wish I was dead, said Marvel. It ain't justice, he said. You must admit it seems to me I have a perfect right. Get on. Mr. Marvel mended his pace, and for a time they went to the silence again. Is there a shot, say Mr. Marvel? This is quite ineffectual. He tried another attack, or do I make by it? He began again in a tone of unendurable wrong. Oh, shut up, to the voice with sudden amazing vigor. I'll see to you all right. You do what you're told, you'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do, I'll tell you, sir. I'm not the man for it, respectfully. But it is so. If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again. To the invisible man I wanted and think. Presently, 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. I shall keep my hand on your shoulder, said the voice all through the village. Go straight through and try no foolery. It will be the worst for you if you do. I know that, sorry. Mr. Marvel, I know all that. The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete. Stillcat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens and vanished into the gathering darkness. Beyond the lights of the windows. Chapter 14. At Port Stowe. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel unshaven, dirty and travel-stained, sitting with the books beside him, and his hands deep in his pockets, looking very weary, nervous, and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals on the bench. Outside, a little in on the outskirts of Port Stowe, beside him were the books, but they were now tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods. Beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with the change in the plans of the Invisible Man, Kakangsha Law Mt Kwakan Tren, Makan Law Mt by HCC via Long Dung Siem va SS Keen Trine.